David Parker Ray, later known as the Toy Box Killer, carried out a series of crimes in New Mexico during the 1990s that still stand among the most disturbing in American criminal history. Unlike many other killers whose names became infamous, Ray was never conclusively linked to dozens of murders. Yet investigators believe he may have had more than 50 victims. His crimes revolved around a specially outfitted trailer he chillingly referred to as his toy box, a place of captivity and torture hidden in the desert outside the small town of Truth or Consequences. David Parker Ray was born in 1939 in Belen, New Mexico. His childhood was fractured, his parents' marriage was unstable, and he was largely raised by a strict grandfather. His father, an abusive man, drifted in and out of his life. When his father did visit, he sometimes gave young David magazines filled with graphic sexual content, images that would imprint themselves deeply on the boy's developing mind. At school, David was quiet and withdrawn, often bullied for his shyness. He never dated and spent much of his free time alone. By adolescence, his inner world had grown dark. He began to develop sadistic fantasies about binding, torturing, and controlling women. He wrote some of these fantasies down in diaries and sketched elaborate devices. These writings, discovered decades later, revealed that his violent sexual imagination had taken root early and never left him. As an adult, Ray joined the U.S. Army and trained as a mechanic. He became skilled with tools and machinery, abilities that would later serve him in constructing his trailer of torture. After his service, he worked various jobs, often as a mechanic and repairman. Outwardly, he appeared unremarkable, an ordinary man living in rural New Mexico. He married and divorced several times, relationships strained by his controlling behavior and secretive habits. By the 1990s, Ray was living in a sparsely populated area near Elephant Butte Lake, close to the small town of Truth or Consequences. There, he kept a property with a modest house, some sheds, and a large trailer. The trailer was no ordinary vehicle. Inside, Ray had spent years constructing what amounted to a private torture chamber. The walls were lined with soundproofing. The space contained a gynecological chair, restraints, surgical instruments, whips, clamps, and a collection of homemade devices. He referred to the place as his toy box. Mounted on the walls were diagrams and photographs. A video camera stood ready to record. In his collection were also audio tapes, carefully prepared, in which Ray described to his victims what was about to happen to them. One of these tapes, later recovered by investigators, opened with a calm, chilling voice introducing itself as if it were a set of instructions. On the tape, Ray explained to the women that they were now his slaves, that they would be tortured, and that resistance was useless. Ray did not act alone. Over the years, he involved accomplices, including his girlfriend Cindy Hendy and sometimes even his own daughter, who was implicated in aspects of the crimes. Together, they lured women, often sex workers or hitchhikers, into the trailer. Victims were drugged, restrained, and subjected to prolonged assaults. One known victim was a woman named Cynthia Vigil. In March 1999, she was abducted by Ray and Hendy after accepting a ride. She was taken to the toy box, where she was chained and tortured. For 3 days, she was held captive. But when Hendy carelessly left the keys within reach, Cynthia managed to free herself. Naked and bleeding, with a metal collar still around her neck, she fled into the street, flagging down a passerby who took her to safety. Her escape led directly to Ray's arrest. Police raided his property and found the trailer. Inside, they discovered the chair, the restraints, and the equipment exactly as Cynthia had described. They also found the recorded tapes, including one that investigators believed had been played to multiple victims. The contents confirmed that Ray had been carrying out his crimes for years. Further searches uncovered diaries in which Ray had documented crimes dating back decades, including references to victims whose bodies were never found. Authorities combed the desert around his property, searching for graves, but the terrain was vast, and no remains were conclusively linked to him. Ray was charged with kidnapping and sexual torture. His trial drew national attention. Cynthia Vigil testified about her ordeal, describing how she had been chained, whipped, and threatened with death inside the trailer. Two other women also came forward, each with similar stories. The evidence, combined with the physical reality of the toy box, left little doubt as to his guilt. In 2001, Ray was convicted of kidnapping and torture. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison. Cindy Hendy received a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. Despite the scale of the crimes, Ray never faced murder charges, as no bodies were definitively tied to him. Still, investigators remained convinced that he had killed many of his victims. Their remains lost in the New Mexico desert. On May 28, 2002, David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in prison, just 3 years after his arrest. His crimes left behind a legacy of horror. The toy box, dismantled after the investigation, became a symbol of hidden evil lurking behind the facade of an ordinary man. The case also fueled debate about how many women might have been murdered without leaving a trace, and how many families would never know what became of their missing loved ones. Next story, Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, was one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history, operating in the Soviet Union during the 1970s and 1980s. His crimes revealed deep flaws in Soviet policing and shocked the world with their brutality. He was born in 1936 in a small Ukrainian village, during one of the darkest times in Soviet history. His early childhood was marked by famine, deprivation, and war. Food shortages were severe, and his family lived in poverty. Rumors in the village suggested that one of his older siblings had been kidnapped and cannibalized during the famine, a story that haunted him for the rest of his life. His father was later drafted into the Red Army during World War II and captured by the Germans, an event that brought shame to the family in a regime that considered captured soldiers traitors. As a child, Chikatilo was weak and often bullied. He suffered from bedwetting into adolescence, and he grew up socially isolated, painfully shy, and plagued by sexual dysfunction. He felt powerless and humiliated, both at home and among peers. By his teenage years, he discovered that he could only achieve arousal through violent fantasies, often involving domination and control. In the 1960s, Chikatilo tried to live a normal life. He married, had children, and worked as a teacher. Outwardly, he appeared quiet, reserved, even timid. But beneath that image, his violent urges grew stronger. While teaching, he was caught fondling students and was dismissed from one of his positions. He drifted into clerical jobs, eventually working in a factory. His crimes escalated in secret. In 1978, Chikatilo committed his first known murder. He lured a 9-year-old girl, Yelena Zakitnova, into a house he had purchased. There, he assaulted and killed her, disposing of her body in a river. Although he was questioned, another man was wrongly accused and executed for the crime, allowing Chikatilo to walk free. This miscarriage of justice would repeat in his career, as Soviet authorities, desperate to maintain order, sometimes arrested innocent men rather than admit a serial killer was at large. From then on, Chikatilo embarked on a spree of killings that lasted more than a decade. His victims were mostly women and children, lured with promises of food, money, or small gifts. He targeted runaways, the homeless, and the vulnerable, people less likely to be reported missing immediately. His method was sadistic. He would lead victims into wooded or isolated areas, then attack suddenly. He stabbed repeatedly, often dozens of times, and mutilated bodies in a frenzy. Many victims were disemboweled. Some had eyes gouged out, a detail that puzzled investigators until Chikatilo later confessed that he believed a Russian superstition that a victim's eyes retained the image of their killer. For years, Soviet authorities failed to catch him. The secrecy of the Soviet system made police reluctant to admit a serial killer existed, as such crimes were seen as a symptom of Western decadence, not socialism. The investigation dragged on, involving hundreds of officers, thousands of interviews, and countless dead ends. Innocent men were arrested, imprisoned, even executed while Chikatilo continued to kill. By the mid-1980s, the murders were so numerous that authorities could no longer deny the pattern. The press remained muzzled, but people whispered of the maniac of Rostov. Special units were formed. Profilers studied the crimes and concluded that the killer was an ordinary man with a respectable appearance, someone who could blend in unnoticed. In 1990, after more than 50 known murders, Chikatilo's luck began to run out. Police had begun placing plainclothes officers at train stations and bus depots, areas where the killer often lured victims. On one such patrol, an officer noticed Chikatilo emerging from the woods, disheveled and suspicious. He was detained, and forensic evidence eventually tied him to multiple crime scenes. When interrogated, Chikatilo at first denied everything. But confronted with mounting evidence, he broke down. In long, chilling confessions, he described his crimes in detail, often with little emotion. He admitted to more than 50 murders, recounting how he had lured victims, how he mutilated them, and how the killings gave him release from urges he could not control. His trial in 1992 was a spectacle. Behind bars, inside a steel cage in the courtroom, Chikatilo sat while prosecutors read the charges of 53 murders. The families of victims wept and shouted. Chikatilo sometimes shouted back, sometimes ranted incoherently. The proceedings were broadcast widely, and the Soviet public, now in the era of glasnost, was horrified. He was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. In 1994, he was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. The case of Andrei Chikatilo exposed the vulnerabilities of Soviet policing. The wrongful arrests and executions of innocent men underscored how secrecy and denial had allowed a predator to operate for years. Forensic and investigative methods improved in Russia as a result, but for the families of victims, the damage was irreparable. Chikatilo's crimes remain a grim reminder of how monstrous violence can hide beneath the surface of an ordinary life. Next story. Joachim George Kroll was born on April 17, 1933, in the German city of Hindenburg, which today lies in Poland. His childhood unfolded against the backdrop of World War II. His family was poor, with many mouths to feed, and food was scarce. His father was conscripted into the German army and later captured by Soviet forces, spending years as a prisoner of war. This left the household without stability or protection, and young Joachim grew up in an environment marked by deprivation. Kroll was a weak, frail child. He suffered academically, never advancing beyond the most basic levels of schooling. Teachers described him as slow. He left school without qualifications, and he struggled with speech and social development. Later in life, psychological testing would show that he had an extremely low IQ, with the mind of a young child despite his adult body. After the war, the Kroll family relocated to West Germany. Joachim worked as a farmhand in his teenage years, tending animals and carrying out simple manual tasks. He lived in isolation, and his relationships with others remained shallow. His social awkwardness kept him distant from girls, and his lack of confidence turned into deep frustration. By his 20s, he had developed violent sexual fantasies that replaced real connections. He was incapable of forming a normal romantic or sexual relationship, and instead imagined control, killing, and possession. In 1955, at the age of 22, Kroll committed his first known murder. He encountered a young girl named Irmgard Strell. Luring her away to a secluded spot, he strangled her to death. Afterward, he mutilated the body and cut away pieces of flesh to take home. Later, he confessed that he cooked and ate the flesh, claiming it allowed him to save money on food. The murder was shocking, but police at the time failed to link Kroll to the crime. With no suspects, the case went cold, and Kroll returned to his quiet life, unnoticed. This first killing set a pattern that would stretch on for more than 2 decades. Kroll's victims were typically women and children, people he found vulnerable and alone. He would approach them in isolated areas such as fields, forests, or riverbanks. His attacks involved strangulation, stabbing, or both. After killing, he often sexually assaulted the body, and in many cases he cut off parts of the flesh. These pieces he brought back to a small apartment to cook and eat later. In 1956, just a year after his first crime, he killed again. His victim was a 12-year-old girl named Manuela Note. She was reported missing after failing to return home. Searchers later found her body in the woods. Like before, the body had been mutilated. Panic spread in the community, but investigators made little progress. By 1959, he struck once more, this time murdering Clara Frida Tesmer. That same year, he killed another young woman, showing that his killings were not isolated impulses, but a recurring compulsion. Each time, police investigated thoroughly, but Kroll's unremarkable appearance shielded him. He was quiet, polite, and looked like an ordinary factory worker. During the 1960s, the murders continued. In 1962, he murdered Monica Taffel, a 12-year-old girl, stabbing her multiple times. This time, suspicion fell on another man, who was arrested and convicted, further allowing Kroll to remain free. In 1966, he killed Ursula Rolling, a young woman who had been walking home. Later that same year, he murdered a 5-year-old girl, and not long after, he killed another child. Each victim was subjected to the same brutality: strangulation, stabbing, mutilation. The cases remained unsolved. Through the 1960s and 1970s, Kroll's murders followed the same rhythm. He would lure a victim, kill, mutilate, and then disappear into his life of anonymity. His killings were spread across different towns and regions within the Ruhr area, making it difficult for investigators to connect the crimes. At times, innocent men were arrested, charged, and convicted, while the Real killer moved unnoticed through the city streets. Kroll lived in small, cramped apartments, working in low-wage factory jobs. He was seen as odd but not threatening. Neighbors described him as a man who kept to himself. He often carried small bags of groceries, and he never invited anyone into his home. He had no relationships, no wife, no close friends. In 1976, his final crime led to his capture. In July of that year, a 4-year-old girl named Marion Ketter went missing near his apartment building. Neighbors raised the alarm, and police began to search. At the same time, other residents of the building reported a problem with their plumbing. The pipes had become clogged. Repairmen investigated, and to their horror, they found human flesh blocking the drainage system. This discovery pointed investigators directly to Kroll. Police entered his apartment, and what they found was a scene of quiet horror. In his kitchen, pots were on the stove, filled with stew made of potatoes, carrots, and pieces of human flesh. In his refrigerator, police found more human remains. The missing girl had been cut apart and was in the process of being cooked. Kroll was arrested on the spot. When questioned, he confessed with little resistance. His manner was calm, almost childlike. He admitted to killing 13 people over more than 2 decades, though investigators suspected the true number may have been higher. He explained his method, how he lured victims, how he strangled them, how he cut away flesh, and how he cooked it. In his own words, he said the flesh helped him save money on groceries. His trial began years later, in 1982. Prosecutors presented the evidence: his confession, the remains, and the long trail of murders. His defense argued diminished responsibility due to his low intelligence. Indeed, he was mentally impaired, but psychiatric experts testified that he understood his actions were wrong. The court agreed. Joachim Kroll was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was sent to prison, where he lived out the rest of his life quietly. In 1991, at the age of 58, he died behind bars of natural causes. The case of Joachim Kroll left behind deep scars in West Germany. For decades, a man who appeared harmless and ordinary had carried out some of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. His actions revealed not only the darkness inside him, but also the failures of police investigations that allowed him to escape detection for so long. Albert DeSalvo, later known as the Boston Strangler, was responsible for one of the most terrifying crime waves in American history. His name became tied to the murder of 13 women in the Boston area during the early 1960s, crimes that sent shockwaves through the city and remain debated to this day. Albert Henry DeSalvo was born on September 3, 1931, in Chelsea, Massachusetts. His upbringing was marked by poverty and violence. His father, Frank, was an alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and children. Frank DeSalvo's brutality was extreme. He once broke every finger on his wife's hand, and on another occasion, he forced his children to watch him have sex with prostitutes. The home was one of chaos, neglect, and abuse. Albert grew up in this environment with little guidance. By his early teens, he had turned to petty crime. He was arrested several times for burglary and other minor offenses. Reform school and juvenile detention became familiar places for him. Despite his troubles, he managed to join the U.S. Army at age 17. He served in Germany, where he gained a reputation as a competent soldier, but also developed a habit of soliciting prostitutes and committing minor theft. After returning home, DeSalvo married and had children. Outwardly, he tried to live a stable life, working various jobs including maintenance and construction. Yet beneath the surface, he remained troubled. He developed a compulsion for sexual assaults that escalated from indecent exposure to home invasions. By the late 1950s, DeSalvo began what police would later call the Measuring Man incidents. He posed as a modeling scout, approaching women and convincing them to let him take their measurements under the guise of offering them opportunities in modeling. While this behavior was strange and invasive, it did not immediately lead to charges, and DeSalvo continued to refine his predatory behavior. Soon after, he escalated into what police called the Green Man crimes. He posed as a handyman or maintenance worker, tricking his way into women's apartments. Once inside, he assaulted them. These assaults went unconnected at the time, but they showed the same compulsions that would lead to murder. In June 1962, the first of the Boston Strangler murders occurred. A 55-year-old woman named Anna Sleezers was found dead in her Boston apartment. She had been strangled with the belt of her bathrobe, tied in a bow around her neck. The staging was strange and deliberate. Within weeks, more murders followed. Most of the victims were women living alone, ranging in age from their 50s to their 80s. They were strangled with items of clothing, often left tied in decorative knots. Some were sexually assaulted. Others were mutilated. The pattern was chilling, and panic swept through Boston. Women kept their doors locked, neighborhoods grew tense, and newspapers filled their front pages with warnings about the killers stalking the city. The murders continued in 1963 and 1964. In total, 13 women were killed. While most were older women, later victims included young women in their 20s, broadening the victim profile and further confusing investigators. Despite massive police efforts, the case remained unsolved. Thousands of interviews were conducted, tips poured in, and detectives searched tirelessly, but the killer always seemed one step ahead. DeSalvo was finally arrested in 1964, but not for the murders. He had been caught for a series of sexual assaults, part of the Green Man cases. While in custody, he confessed to his cellmate, George Nasser, that he was the Boston Strangler. Nasser informed attorney F. Lee Bailey, who brought DeSalvo's claims to the authorities. DeSalvo then gave detailed confessions to police, describing the murders in ways that seemed to match the crime scenes. He admitted to all 13 killings. However, there was no physical evidence linking him to the murders, and his confession was inconsistent at times. Some investigators doubted he was truly the Strangler, believing he may have exaggerated or invented his involvement for notoriety or a plea bargain. In court, DeSalvo was not tried for the Boston Strangler murders due to lack of evidence. Instead, he was convicted of numerous sexual assaults and sentenced to life in prison in 1967. While in prison, DeSalvo was stabbed to death in 1973 under mysterious circumstances. Officially, another inmate killed him during a dispute, but speculation has lingered that his death may have been arranged to silence him. For decades, debate continued over whether DeSalvo was truly the Boston Strangler. In 2013, modern DNA testing linked him to the 1964 murder of Mary Sullivan, one of the final victims. The evidence confirmed that DeSalvo was responsible for at least that killing, strengthening the case that he had been the Strangler all along. The story of Albert DeSalvo remains both terrifying and tragic. It revealed a man shaped by a brutal childhood, driven by compulsion and able to terrorize an entire city. At the same time, it showed the limits of police investigations in an era before DNA, when confessions were often the strongest evidence available. Arthur Shawcross, later called the Genesee River Killer, became known in the late 1980s as one of New York's most notorious serial killers. His crimes exposed deep failures in the justice system, since he had already been convicted of murder years earlier, only to be released and kill again. Arthur John Shawcross was born on June 6, 1945, in Kittery, Maine, the first of 4 children. His family moved often during his childhood, eventually settling in Watertown, New York. His early years were troubled. He was described as a slow learner, prone to bullying, and known for violent temper tantrums. Teachers reported that he had difficulties with reading and writing, but also noted his tendency to lash out physically. Later in life, Shawcross claimed that he was sexually abused as a child, both by relatives and older neighborhood children. He also claimed his mother engaged in inappropriate behavior with him. Whether all of these claims were true or exaggerations is debated, but there is little doubt that his upbringing was unstable. By his teenage years, Shawcross had dropped out of school and drifted into petty crime. He was arrested several times for burglary and vandalism. At age 19, he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He served in Vietnam during the height of the war, working in supply units. Shawcross later told wild stories about his time in combat, including claims of cannibalism and brutal killings, but investigators who reviewed his record found little to support these accounts. What is clear is that his time in the military hardened him, and he returned to the United States more violent than before. Back in New York, Shawcross married and divorced several times. He struggled to hold steady jobs and continued to commit small crimes. In 1972, his violence escalated into murder. That year, he lured a 10-year-old boy named Jack Owen Blake into the woods near Watertown. Shawcross sexually assaulted the boy, strangled him, and left the body hidden. Weeks later, he lured an 8-year-old girl named Karen and Hill to a secluded spot near a riverbank, where he assaulted and killed her as well. The murders shocked the community, and suspicion eventually fell on Shawcross. He confessed and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. While incarcerated, Shawcross underwent psychiatric evaluations. Doctors noted his lack of remorse and his disturbing fantasies, but despite warnings, he became eligible for parole after serving only 14 years. In 1987, he was released. After his release, Shawcross settled in Rochester, New York, with a new girlfriend. For a short time, he lived quietly, working menial jobs. But within a year, he returned to killing, this time targeting sex workers. Between 1988 and 1989, Shawcross murdered 11 women, most of them prostitutes he picked up on the streets of Rochester. He lured them into his car, drove them to secluded areas near the Genesee River, and attacked. His methods included strangulation and blunt force. After killing, he often left the bodies in wooded or marshy areas, sometimes partially concealed but often exposed. The murders caused alarm in Rochester, but at first, police struggled to connect them. Many of the victims were women who lived precarious lives, making their disappearances less immediately noticed. As bodies began to turn up, investigators realized they were dealing with a serial killer. The FBI was brought in to assist, and profilers built a psychological portrait of the murderer, a middle-aged white male, familiar with the area, with a history of violence. Police began surveillance operations, focusing on areas where sex workers gathered. In January 1990, Shawcross was placed under observation after being seen with a known prostitute. Days later, surveillance units followed him as he drove to a remote location. They watched him stop by a riverbank where the body of one of his victims had recently been found. This suspicious behavior gave them the opening they needed. Shawcross was arrested soon afterward. In custody, Shawcross at first denied the killings. Confronted with evidence, he eventually confessed in detail to 11 murders. He spoke matter-of-factly, describing how he picked up women, where he drove them, how he strangled them, and how he left their bodies. He showed little emotion as he described the crimes. His trial in 1991 was widely covered by the media. The defense argued that Shawcross suffered from brain damage and post-traumatic stress disorder from Vietnam, suggesting diminished responsibility. Psychiatrists debated his mental state, but the jury found him guilty on 10 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 250 years in prison, ensuring he would never be released. Arthur Shawcross lived in prison until 2008, when he died of a heart attack at the age of 63. The case left behind lingering outrage. Families of his first child victims in the 1970s had warned authorities that Shawcross should never have been released, yet the system allowed him out after just 14 years. His return to violence, claiming 11 more lives, became a grim lesson in the consequences of early parole for dangerous offenders. Richard Ramirez, who would become known to the world as the Night Stalker, was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a Mexican-American working-class family. His father, Julian, had been a policeman in Mexico before moving to the United States to work on the railroad. Julian was a strict, authoritarian man, quick to anger, and often physically abusive to his children. Mercedes, Richard's mother, worked in a local boot factory and was exposed to toxic chemicals daily. Richard's early years were filled with tension and fear. He lived under the shadow of a father who demanded obedience and punished any perceived misstep. His siblings recalled him as quiet, withdrawn, and constantly anxious, seeking safety by hiding or avoiding confrontation. From a young age, Richard suffered serious head injuries. At age 2, a dresser fell on him, leaving him unconscious. At 5, he was struck by a swing, causing further trauma. He later experienced frequent blackouts and seizures. These injuries would later be studied by psychologists as factors contributing to his later violent behavior. Despite his fragility, Richard developed a fascination with death and violence. He would spend hours alone, exploring cemeteries or rooftops, imagining scenarios of control and dominance over others. During his early teens, Richard formed a close relationship with his older cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran. Miguel returned from combat, carrying not only physical and emotional scars, but also disturbing stories and photographs depicting women he claimed to have tortured and killed. To a 13-year-old Richard, Miguel became a role model, demonstrating that power and fear could be wielded through violence. One night, Richard witnessed Miguel shoot his wife during a domestic argument, killing her instantly. Rather than recoiling, Richard internalized the event, absorbing the association between death, control, and personal power. He visited Miguel repeatedly after the incident, learning survival skills and the use of weapons. By his mid-teens, Richard's criminal behavior escalated. He smoked marijuana, experimented with LSD, and later became addicted to cocaine. He began stealing from neighbors, breaking into cars, and committing petty theft. School became increasingly irrelevant, and he dropped out in the 9th grade. His home life offered no guidance, and his fascination with violence intensified. At 17, he left El Paso for California, seeking independence and opportunity, while simultaneously moving toward a life of increasingly serious crime. He lived in motels, drifting between Los Angeles and San Francisco, committing burglaries and thefts to fund his growing drug habit. In June 1984, Richard crossed the threshold from theft and petty crime to murder. He broke into the Los Angeles apartment of 79-year-old Jenny Vinkow and slit her throat nearly to decapitation. The brutality of the act shocked authorities and signaled the emergence of a dangerous new predator. Over the next year, Ramirez committed a series of home invasion murders. Unlike most serial killers, he did not limit himself to one profile of victim. He attacked elderly men and women, young couples, and occasionally children. His methods varied. He shot some victims, stabbed others, and strangled or beat many. He sexually assaulted women and stole valuables, funding his drug addiction while leaving behind a trail of terror and death. By March 1985, Ramirez had intensified his spree, attacking multiple victims in a single night. Maria Hernandez survived being shot in her garage, but her roommate Dale Okazaki was killed. Hours later, he pulled Sally and Yu from her car and shot her. Soon after, he killed Vincent and Maxine Zazera in their home. Vincent was shot while sleeping. Maxine was bound and brutally mutilated, her eyes removed and placed in a jewelry box. These crimes reflected not only brutality, but a ritualistic element, satisfying Ramirez's desire for domination and control over life and death. During the summer of 1985, Ramirez continued his attacks, often entering homes through unlocked windows or doors. Survivors described him as foul-smelling, with decayed teeth, bloodshot eyes, and a cold, emotionless gaze. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker, and fear spread across Los Angeles and surrounding counties. People avoided going out at night, installed alarms and locks, and armed themselves for protection. Schools warned children, parents kept them indoors, and entire neighborhoods felt unsafe. Police struggled to track him, though evidence slowly accumulated. Shoe prints from obvious sneakers, fingerprints, and ballistic analyses linked multiple crime scenes. Yet Ramirez remained elusive, moving between Los Angeles and San Francisco, striking at random. His unpredictability made him extremely difficult to catch, and residents lived in constant fear. The breakthrough occurred in late August 1985. After attacking a couple in Mission Viejo, Ramirez fled when residents observed his car and license plate. Police recovered the stolen vehicle and discovered a fingerprint that matched Richard Ramirez, a 25-year-old drifter with prior arrests for theft and drug charges. His photograph appeared in newspapers and on television, giving the Night Stalker a face for the first time. The following day, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles, unaware that he had been identified. Shoppers recognized him instantly. Panicked, he attempted to flee, trying to steal a car. Residents pursued him, shouting that he was the Night Stalker. He was eventually cornered, beaten by citizens, and arrested by police. After months of terror, the reign of Richard Ramirez had ended not with a dramatic law enforcement operation, but with the intervention of ordinary people determined to stop him. Next story. Richard Benjamin Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois, into a family marked by instability and frequent upheaval. His father, Franklin Speck, was a strict man with a volatile temper, often physically abusive to his children. His mother, Doris, struggled with mental health issues and moved the family frequently, leaving young Richard with a sense of impermanence and insecurity. From early childhood, he displayed troubling behavior. He had difficulty in school, was often truant, and showed a growing pattern of deceit and aggression. He learned to manipulate adults, evade authority, and act impulsively, traits that would define his later life. As a teenager, Richard began experimenting with petty theft and burglary. He dropped out of high school and moved from job to job, rarely staying in one place. He developed a heavy drinking habit, sometimes mixing it with drugs, and his life spiraled into a series of minor criminal activities, including car theft, assault, and breaking and entering. His relationships with women were turbulent. He married once briefly and fathered a child, but his inability to maintain stability led to estrangement. He became increasingly isolated and resentful, harboring anger at authority and at the social structures that he felt had failed him. By 1965, Speck had developed a pattern of moving from city to city, often staying in cheap hotels or boarding houses, committing small thefts, and drinking heavily. In July 1966, he arrived in Chicago, Illinois, where he found work as a laborer and occasionally at local bars. During this period, he became acquainted with women working in nursing and other service professions, learning their routines and locations. Speck's fascination with power and control over others grew, and his fantasies of domination began to focus on women in vulnerable positions. On the night of July 13th, 1966, Richard Speck entered a small student nurses' residence in South Chicago. 8 student nurses were living there at the time. Speck had observed the residents, learning the habits of the women and when they would be home. That night, he gained entry by overpowering a young man who lived in the building. Once inside, Speck systematically terrorized the residents. He bound, beat, and murdered 7 of the 8 women in a horrific spree that lasted several hours. The brutality of the murders was extreme, yet Speck displayed a disturbing level of calm and methodical behavior. He moved from room to room, selecting victims, tying them up, and using a knife to carry out his attacks. One young woman survived by hiding under a bed and remained undiscovered until Speck left the premises. Her testimony would later become crucial in reconstructing the events of that night. When authorities arrived the next morning, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. 7 young women had been murdered, and the 8th survivor provided the first detailed account of the assailant. The crime shocked the nation. Chicago, already wary of violent crime in its neighborhoods, was gripped by terror. Residents locked doors, women avoided being alone at night, and the media broadcast the gruesome details widely. The manhunt for Speck was immediate. Chicago police, state authorities, and the FBI coordinated to apprehend him. Investigators discovered that Speck had left behind evidence in the form of fingerprints, personal items, and a distinct pattern of movement through the city. Witnesses described seeing a man matching his appearance fleeing the area. Speck attempted to hide in cheap motels and with acquaintances, but the public was on alert and police intensified patrols. Speck's capture came 10 days later when he was recognized by a taxi driver who had picked him up in a hotel lobby. Authorities arrested him without incident. Once in custody, Speck was cooperative in identifying locations he had visited and provided limited information about the murders, but he expressed little remorse. Psychological evaluations conducted during his detention revealed a pattern of antisocial behavior, narcissism, and extreme impulsivity. Experts concluded that he was driven by deep-seated anger toward women, combined with a sense of entitlement and a fascination with domination. The trial of Richard Speck began in April 1967. The courtroom was packed, the public intensely interested in a case that had shocked the nation. Evidence included survivor testimony, forensic analysis, and witness accounts. Speck's demeanor in court was unsettling. He displayed a calm, almost detached presence while the prosecution presented graphic details of the murders. His defense attempted to claim mental instability, but expert testimony and the premeditated nature of the crimes undermined these claims. After deliberation, the jury found Speck guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. Over the years, Speck's sentence was reduced to life imprisonment after changes in death penalty law and appeals. He spent decades in Illinois correctional facilities, where he became notorious among fellow inmates and staff for erratic behavior. Despite efforts at rehabilitation, he remained largely unrepentant. Speck's life ended in prison on December 5, 1991, from natural causes. The murders of the South Chicago student nurses left a lasting scar on the community and reshaped public awareness of personal safety and the vulnerability of women living alone. Speck's methodical cruelty and ability to evade capture for days created a profound fear, and his case remains a subject of study for criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals seeking to understand the mind of a predator who operated in plain sight. Next story. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her early life was marked by trauma, neglect, and instability. Her mother, Diane, was a teenager at the time of Eileen's birth and had a history of alcoholism. Eileen's biological father was largely absent, and she was raised in a household fraught with poverty and abuse. At the age of 4, her parents' relationship ended, and Eileen's mother soon abandoned her, leaving her to be raised by her grandparents. Her grandfather was reportedly abusive, physically punishing her and her brother for minor misbehaviors. By the time she was 8, Aileen had experienced profound emotional and physical neglect, shaping a deep mistrust of adults and authority. By her early teens, Aileen began showing troubling behavior. She was often truant from school and had difficulty forming stable friendships. She ran away from home several times and entered a cycle of petty theft, substance abuse, and sexual activity with older men. At 13, she became pregnant, though the child was later stillborn. The combination of trauma, early sexualization, and exposure to violence created a foundation for the behavior that would later define her criminal life. After leaving Michigan, Aileen drifted through several states, living on the margins of society. By the late 1970s, she had arrived in Florida, where she became a sex worker to support herself. During this time, she met several men who would further influence her developing perception of the world as a dangerous and hostile place. She suffered assaults and betrayals that reinforced her sense of anger and desperation. Aileen's violent crimes began in earnest in 1989. Over the course of roughly a year, she murdered 7 men in Florida, claiming self-defense in each case. Her victims were mostly middle-aged men she met while working as a sex worker. In each encounter, Aileen alleged that the men attempted to assault or exploit her, and she responded with lethal force. She used a .22 caliber pistol to carry out the killings, shooting her victims in the head or chest. The crimes were committed in various locations, including parking lots, rural roads, and hotel rooms, reflecting both her mobility and the chaotic nature of her life. The first known murder occurred in November 1989, when Aileen killed Richard Mallory, a man she had met while working the streets of Daytona Beach. She shot him at close range and left his body near a wooded area. Over the next year, she killed 6 more men under similar circumstances, often driving to remote locations to commit the acts. Each murder was followed by theft of the victim's wallet or car, both to sustain herself and as a form of escape. Law enforcement initially struggled to link the murders. The victims came from different areas, and the crimes were spread across multiple counties. Investigators eventually identified a pattern through ballistic analysis and witness statements. Surveillance and tips from citizens eventually led authorities to focus on Aileen as a suspect. She was arrested on January 9, 1991, after a relative provided information that implicated her in the murders. During interrogation, Aileen was strikingly candid. She admitted to killing the men, but insisted that she acted in self-defense, fearing for her life each time she drew her gun. Psychological evaluations later diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder and antisocial tendencies, but her attorneys argued that her unstable upbringing and trauma played a major role in her actions. The case quickly drew national attention, with the media portraying her both as a cold-blooded killer and a victim of circumstance. The trial for the first murder began in 1992. Aileen was convicted of killing Richard Mallory and sentenced to death. Subsequent trials resulted in additional death sentences for the other murders. Despite her notoriety, she remained a figure of public fascination, with debates surrounding her mental health, the influence of abuse, and the morality of her actions. Aileen Wuornos spent her final years on death row in Florida. She became the subject of documentaries, books, and films, all exploring her life, crimes, and psychology. On October 9, 2002, she was executed by lethal injection. Her life and crimes left a lasting impression on American society, highlighting the intersections of trauma, gender, and violence, and sparking ongoing discussion about the circumstances that can produce such extreme criminal behavior. Next story. David Richard Berkowitz was born on June 1, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His early life was fraught with confusion and emotional instability. He was adopted shortly after birth by the Berkowitz family, who had been unable to conceive a child of their own. Although they provided material stability, David felt alienated and rejected, struggling with feelings of abandonment and inadequacy. His adoptive mother was overprotective and controlling, while his father was distant and authoritarian. These dynamics fostered in David a profound sense of anger and isolation, which would later manifest in violent behavior. As a teenager, David began exhibiting troubling behaviors. He became fascinated with weapons, particularly firearms, and developed an interest in vigilante justice and the occult. He experimented with drugs, often marijuana, and engaged in petty theft and other minor criminal activities. He struggled to form stable social connections, often retreating into fantasies where he wielded power over others. His fascination with religion and the supernatural intensified, and he became convinced that he was part of a larger cosmic struggle between good and evil. In the early 1970s, David married a young woman named Elizabeth, but the marriage was unstable. He found employment sporadically, often quitting jobs abruptly or being dismissed for misconduct. During this period, he began to experience auditory hallucinations, claiming that he was receiving messages from a demon-possessed dog who commanded him to kill. He became obsessed with these messages, believing that he had been chosen to punish people for their sins. On the night of July 29, 1976, David Berkowitz began a series of shootings that would terrorize New York City for over a year. He targeted young couples sitting in parked cars, shooting at them from the sidewalk with a .44 caliber revolver. The first known victim, Donna Loria, and her boyfriend were seriously wounded, but escaped with minor injuries. Over the following months, Berkowitz escalated his attacks, killing several victims and injuring others. His method was simple but terrifying. Approach couples in secluded areas at night, open fire, and flee without leaving an obvious trace. The city was gripped by fear. New York newspapers ran daily updates, and the police were under immense pressure to apprehend the shooter. Residents avoided going out at night. Parents warned teenagers about dating in secluded areas, and many people carried weapons for protection. The randomness of the attacks and the apparent invisibility of the killer created a climate of paranoia, with the public unsure when or where the next attack might occur. Berkowitz became increasingly bold, leaving letters for the police and newspapers that taunted investigators. In one such letter, he signed himself the Son of Sam, the name that would become infamous nationwide. These letters revealed his obsession with notoriety and his desire to control public perception of his crimes. The letters were filled with references to demonic possession, religious punishment, and personal justifications for his actions. Investigators eventually traced the shootings through a combination of witness reports, ballistic evidence, and careful analysis of Berkowitz's movements. On August 10, 1977, the investigation culminated in his capture. A uniformed police officer noticed Berkowitz's suspicious behavior while he was parking a car, and after questioning, Berkowitz confessed to the shootings. He provided details of his crimes, the locations of each attack, and explained his belief that he had been commanded by supernatural forces. David Berkowitz was tried in 1978 and pleaded guilty to 6 murders and several attempted murders. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In prison, he became a born-again Christian, expressing remorse for his actions and participating in religious study groups. Despite his confessions and rehabilitation efforts, the Son of Sam case left a permanent imprint on New York City, reshaping public consciousness about safety, the unpredictability of violent crime, and the media's role in creating fear and fascination around serial killers. The case also prompted changes in law enforcement tactics, particularly in response to public threats that spanned multiple jurisdictions. Berkowitz's combination of random attacks, media interaction, and psychological complexity made him one of the most studied criminals of the late 20th century. His life story, crimes, and eventual repentance remain a cautionary tale about the intersection of mental illness, obsession, and societal neglect. Next story. Edward Theodore Gain was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the second of 2 children in a family shaped by strict religious beliefs and isolation. His father, George Gain, was a harsh, domineering man who struggled with alcohol and frequently criticized his children. His mother, Augusta, was intensely religious, fanatical in her beliefs, and instilled in Ed a deep fear of women, sex, and sin. She preached that all women, aside from herself, were inherently corrupt and destined for damnation. Augusta's obsessive control created an environment in which Ed grew up terrified, obedient, and socially withdrawn. From an early age, Ed was described as quiet, lonely, and withdrawn. He had minimal contact with other children, attending school only sporadically, and was frequently bullied for his strange behavior. He became fascinated with death and graveyards, often visiting the local cemetery alone. His mother's extreme teachings about sin and punishment instilled in him both guilt and fear, particularly around sexuality. After his father's death in 1940 and the death of his brother shortly thereafter, Ed was left alone with his mother. Her influence intensified as he became her primary companion. He obeyed her every demand and developed an unhealthy attachment, never forming friendships outside the home. After Augusta Gain died in 1945, Ed was left isolated and unprepared to navigate normal social life. He became increasingly withdrawn, spending time scavenging in graveyards at night. His fascination with human remains grew into an obsession. He would dig up recently buried corpses, removing body parts and bringing them home. Over time, he began to commit murders to acquire human flesh directly, eliminating the uncertainty of grave robbing. Ed Gain's first confirmed murder occurred in 1954 when he killed Mary Hogan, a local barmaid. He strangled her and later mutilated her body, keeping parts of it in his home. Over the next several years, he continued similar acts, often targeting elderly women resembling his mother in appearance. He would murder, dismember, and preserve their body parts, using them for personal rituals, clothing, or household items. His crimes remained undiscovered for years due to the rural isolation of his property and the infrequency of his public interactions. The horror of Gaines' activities came to light in 1957 after the disappearance of Bernice Wardens, a local hardware store owner. Police traced her last known movements to Gaines' property and discovered a series of grotesque and shocking items. In his home, investigators found human skulls, bones fashioned into household furniture, and preserved skin used to create masks, clothing, and decorations. The entire property was a scene of macabre obsession, reflecting both his meticulous planning and his psychological disturbance. He admitted to grave robbing and to the murders, but claimed he was compelled by his desire to create women's suits from the skin of the deceased. Ed Gaines' arrest and trial captivated the nation. Psychologists evaluated him and determined that he suffered from severe mental illness, including schizotypal personality disorder and necrophilic tendencies. He was found legally insane and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric institution rather than prison. Gaines' case became one of the most infamous examples of how isolation, abuse, and psychological disturbance could culminate in extreme criminal behavior. During his time in institutions, Gaines remained a figure of public fascination. His story influenced numerous books, films, and fictional characters, including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. Despite the sensationalism, experts emphasize that Gaines' crimes were the product of an extraordinarily abnormal life, shaped by rigid religious indoctrination, childhood trauma, and profound isolation. Edward Gaines died on July 26, 1984, in a mental institution in Madison, Wisconsin. His legacy remains as a cautionary tale of how untreated psychological trauma, severe social isolation, and obsession can escalate into acts of extreme violence. The Gaines case also influenced forensic psychology and criminal profiling, highlighting the ways that abnormal behavior can escalate to homicide and macabre rituals when left unchecked. The quiet, rural life he led masked the depth of his pathology until his actions were uncovered, leaving a permanent mark on both American criminal history and popular culture. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of three sons in a working-class family. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked as a bus driver, while his mother, Mary, was a retail sales clerk. The family lived a modest life, struggling financially at times, but always trying to maintain appearances of normalcy. From the outside, their household seemed unremarkable, yet within its walls lay tensions and patterns of dysfunction that would later be seen as critical to the making of Killer. As a child, Gary was shy and slow to develop academically. He struggled with reading comprehension and was held back in school more than once. Teachers noticed that he seemed detached, often staring off or failing to grasp lessons. His classmates sometimes mocked him for his lack of intelligence, and he grew up with a deep sense of inferiority. This sense of being less than others would stay with him for life, shaping the way he related to people. At home, the Ridgway family environment was strained. Gary's father often complained about sex workers, speaking of them with contempt. He frequently shared disturbing stories about encounters he had witnessed while driving his bus route near Seattle, where prostitution was common. At the same time, Gary's relationship with his mother was complicated. She was described as domineering, strict, and sometimes humiliating toward him. Gary later spoke of feeling confused by his mother's behavior, especially when she scolded him harshly even as she also cared for him physically in ways that left him with troubling, conflicted emotions. As Gary entered adolescence, he began to show troubling signs of suppressed rage. At the age of 16, in what would later be remembered as a shocking foreshadowing of his adult crimes, he lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. The child survived, but the act revealed a dangerous side of Gary that no one around him truly recognized or understood at the time. It was brushed off as an isolated incident, and Gary moved forward with his life as though nothing had happened. After finishing high school, Gary joined the Navy. He was deployed to Vietnam, where he was exposed to the chaos of war and the widespread use of sex workers among soldiers. He contracted gonorrhea during his service, which filled him with a mixture of guilt and anger, emotions that later became tied to his view of women. When his military service ended, he returned to the United States and settled near Seattle. Gary Ridgway married young, taking a woman named Claudia Craig as his first wife in 1970. But their marriage was troubled from the beginning. He was jealous, controlling, and consumed by suspicions of infidelity. His fixation on sexual activity was overwhelming, and his expectations in the marriage were exhausting to his partner. They divorced within a year. He would marry more than once again, and in each relationship he displayed a disturbing pattern of obsession, control, and infidelity. On the surface, Ridgway lived a seemingly ordinary working-class life. He was employed as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he remained for decades. His co-workers described him as quiet, sometimes odd, but generally reliable. He attended church regularly and sometimes read the Bible aloud at home. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, he was nurturing dark fantasies and behaviors that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The murders that would later be attributed to him began in the early 1980s in the area surrounding the Green River near Seattle. In 1982, the body of a young woman was found in the river. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered, all of them women, many of them known to be sex workers or runaways. The victims were often strangled, sometimes with ligatures, and their bodies were left in wooded areas, ravines, or the river itself. The pattern became clear to investigators. They were dealing with a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his vehicle, murdered them, and then disposed of their bodies in clusters across the landscape. The press soon dubbed him the Green River Killer, a name that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades. The investigation quickly became one of the largest in American history. Task forces were formed, dozens of detectives and FBI profilers were assigned, and yet the killer remained elusive. Ridgway himself was interviewed as early as 1983. He admitted to knowing some of the victims and to picking up sex workers, but he was calm, cooperative, and passed a polygraph test. Without concrete evidence, the investigators let him go. Meanwhile, the bodies continued to accumulate. Throughout the 1980s, women kept vanishing from the Seattle area, many of them last seen near Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road notorious for prostitution. Their remains were later found in clusters in wooded dumping sites that Ridgway returned to more than once. He often revisited the corpses to perform acts of necrophilia, an element of his crimes that remained hidden until his eventual confessions. For years, the task force chased leads, investigated suspects, and tried new forensic methods. Among those who assisted was Robert Keppel, a detective who had previously investigated Ted Bundy. Bundy himself, sitting on death row in Florida at the time, even offered to help profile the Green River Killer. Bundy suggested that the killer likely revisited the bodies and that he chose vulnerable women because he knew their disappearances would draw less attention. At the time, investigators considered Bundy's insights, but still lacked the evidence to make an arrest. Ridgway's double life continued into the 1990s. He remarried, held his job steadily, and maintained a bland suburban existence. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, sometimes friendly, sometimes odd. Few suspected that the quiet man who mowed his lawn and attended barbecues was hiding the darkest of secrets. The break in the case came with the advancement of DNA technology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, samples that had been preserved from the victims were tested using new methods. Semen found on several victims was matched conclusively to Gary Ridgway. In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first murders, Ridgway was finally arrested. The arrest shocked those who knew him. Many could not reconcile the ordinary factory worker with the monstrous crimes. In custody, Ridgway eventually confessed to an astonishing number of murders. He admitted to killing at least 70 women, though he was only formally convicted of 49. His confessions revealed chilling details. He spoke matter-of-factly, with no visible remorse, explaining how he chose women he thought no one would miss, how he strangled them in his truck or home, and how he returned to their bodies long after their deaths. In 2003, Ridgway accepted a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation. He led investigators to previously undiscovered remains and described his methods in cold detail. The families of the victims attended hearings, listening as he recounted the deaths of their loved ones. For many, it was a devastating experience, but it also brought answers after decades of uncertainty. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without parole, serving his time at the Washington State Penitentiary. He remains there to this day, one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Story 2. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into a blue-collar family of Polish and Danish descent. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist who carried the scars of alcoholism and a violent temper. His mother, Marion, was described as a kind and protective woman who tried to shield her children from the worst of their father's anger. John Wayne, known in the family simply as Johnny, was the second of 3 children, with 2 sisters who were close to him throughout his life. From an early age, Gacy's relationship with his father was one of fear and disappointment. The elder Gacy often belittled his son, calling him weak and stupid, mocking him for not being athletic, and sometimes beating him for minor infractions. Johnny longed for approval that never came. Even as he grew older and achieved small successes, his father dismissed him. His mother, on the other hand, offered him compassion and defended him from his father's abuse. But this only deepened the wedge between father and son. As a boy, Gacy suffered from health problems. He experienced fainting spells and was later diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that limited his ability to participate in sports. This weakness made him a target of bullying from peers and further scorn from his father, who saw physical strength as a mark of manhood. These early wounds of rejection and humiliation would stay with him for life. Despite his struggles, Gacy showed an ability to charm and make friends. He had a sociable nature and often tried to win people over with humor and friendliness. By his teenage years, he became active in community organizations, working in grocery stores, and showing leadership qualities that impressed many around him. Yet behind this affable exterior, he carried secrets of confusion about his identity, his desires, and his insecurities. After finishing high school, Gacy moved through a series of jobs, eventually finding work in management positions. He married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, in 1964, and the couple settled in Waterloo, Iowa, where her family owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Gacy managed 3 of these restaurants, earning a good salary and presenting himself as a respectable young businessman. He joined the JCs, a civic organization where he rose quickly through the ranks, known for his enthusiasm and his ability to get others involved. But beneath this respectable exterior, Gacy harbored dark impulses. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy, an offense that shattered the image he had worked so hard to build. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and his wife divorced him, taking their 2 children and severing all ties. After serving just 18 months, Gacy was released in 1970 for good behavior. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life, but the seeds of his future crimes had already been planted. Back in Chicago, Gacy reinvented himself. He started a successful construction business, PDM Contractors, which specialized in painting, decorating, and maintenance. He remarried, this time to a woman named Carol Hoff, a divorced mother with 2 daughters. They moved into a house on Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood. To his neighbors, Gacy appeared to be a model citizen. He hosted parties, often cooking elaborate meals, and became involved in local Democratic Party politics. One of Gacy's most unusual hobbies was performing as a clown. He created 2 characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, sewing the costumes himself and painting his own face. He entertained children at hospitals, charity events, and parades, earning him the nickname the Killer Clown in later years. To those who saw him perform, he seemed harmless, even joyful. Yet this persona masked the terrifying reality of what was happening inside his home. Throughout the 1970s, young men and boys began disappearing in the Chicago area. Many of them were runaways, drifters, or youth-seeking work. Gacy often lured them with promises of construction jobs or money. Some he picked up hitchhiking, others he met at bus stations or on the street. Once inside his home, he would offer them alcohol or show them a trick involving handcuffs, claiming he could demonstrate how to escape. When they were restrained, he revealed his true intentions. He assaulted them, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies. The sheer number of victims is staggering. Over the years, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his house, layering the bodies in trenches that he dug himself. Others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. His ability to maintain his public image while committing these crimes is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Suspicion grew slowly. Some families of the missing reported seeing their sons last with Gacy, and rumors circulated. In 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest became the turning point. Piest was last seen at a pharmacy where Gacy had offered him a job. When he failed to return home, his parents alerted the police, who quickly connected his disappearance to Gacy. A surveillance operation was launched. Detectives followed Gacy, noting his erratic behavior and eventually obtaining a search warrant for his home. What they discovered shocked them. The smell of decomposition in the house was overwhelming. In the crawl space, they began to find bodies, one after another, buried in the earth. The scale of the crime was almost beyond comprehension. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. During questioning, he confessed in chilling detail to the murders. He spoke casually of how he killed the boys, describing them as if they were objects rather than human beings. The trial began in 1980 and lasted for weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, while the defense tried to argue insanity. But the jury was unmoved. Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in United States history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For years, he lived on death row at Menard Correctional Center, appealing his sentence and maintaining at times that he was innocent, at other times admitting to the crimes. He became a notorious figure, even creating paintings that were sold for high prices by collectors morbidly fascinated with him. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some celebrating, others reflecting on the horror of his crimes. His last words were dismissive, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a deep scar on the Chicago community and the families of his victims. His ability to live a double life, to be a businessman, a community volunteer, and a clown who entertained children, while at the same time burying dozens of bodies beneath his home, remains one of the most chilling examples of hidden evil. His case also led to greater awareness of the need for better investigations into missing persons, especially those from vulnerable groups. Story 3. The story of Peter Sutcliffe, later known to the world as the Yorkshire Ripper, begins in a quiet and ordinary setting, one that gave little hint of the darkness that would one day emerge. Born in Bingley, West Yorkshire, in 1946, Sutcliffe grew up in a working-class family in post-war England. His early life was marked by a somewhat withdrawn personality, a boy who seemed more comfortable in solitude than in crowds. Teachers and peers noticed that he was shy and sometimes awkward, but there was little outward sign of what was to come. The landscape of his childhood was one of smoky industrial towns, strict social structures, and families trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of war. As Sutcliffe grew older, those who knew him recalled a young man who seemed caught between the ordinary expectations of life and a deeper sense of disconnection. He worked various jobs, including in a factory and later as a truck driver, but he never seemed to settle. His relationships were strained, though he eventually married Sonia Surma in 1974, a woman who would remain by his side through much of the turmoil that was to follow. Their marriage was unusual, marked by long separations and a lack of intimacy, which only deepened Sutcliffe's sense of isolation. The crimes that would bring his name into infamy began in the mid-1970s. Between 1975 and 1980, women in the north of England began to be attacked with shocking brutality. Many were sex workers, living vulnerable lives on the margins of society. Others were simply ordinary women going about their daily routines. The killings were marked by a distinctive pattern, with the use of a hammer and a sharpened instrument that inflicted terrible injuries. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and deeply violent, leaving behind scenes of horror that confounded the police and terrified the public. The press quickly seized upon the fear, labeling the unknown killer the Yorkshire Ripper, an echo of the Victorian-era Jack the Ripper murders in London. The name stuck, and with it came a wave of public panic. Women across the north of England lived under a shadow of dread, avoiding nighttime travel, staying in groups, and fearing the possibility that the next victim could be anyone. The climate of fear grew so severe that it reshaped social life, particularly for women, and placed immense pressure on law enforcement to find the culprit. The investigation, however, was plagued by mistakes. The West Yorkshire Police launched one of the largest manhunts in British history, interviewing thousands of men, compiling endless files of information, and struggling under the weight of both public expectation and their own internal errors. A major setback came in the form of the so-called Wearside Jack hoax. A man with a strong Sunderland accent sent letters and tapes to the police claiming to be the killer. The police, convinced of the authenticity of the recordings, diverted significant resources to focus on suspects with similar accents. In reality, the letters and tapes were fraudulent, later proven to have been sent by John Samuel Humble, a man with no connection to the actual murders. This misdirection allowed Sutcliffe to continue his killings while the investigation drifted off course. By the end of the decade, the list of victims had grown. Women such as Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, and many more had lost their lives in horrifying circumstances. Some victims were young women with children, others elderly, some students or shop assistants. Each case carried with it grief and devastation for families and communities, while the broader society lived with the constant unease of not knowing when or where the killer would strike next. Despite being interviewed by the police multiple times, Sutcliffe managed to avoid capture. He explained away inconsistencies, charmed his way out of suspicion, and benefited from the disorganization of the investigation. Files were misplaced, connections were overlooked, and the sheer scale of the inquiry left gaps through which Sutcliffe slipped repeatedly. The frustration of the detectives mounted, and the anger of the public grew. Women's rights groups organized protests, demanding greater safety and accountability, and criticizing the police for failing to protect the vulnerable. The breakthrough finally came in January 1981. Sutcliffe was arrested in Sheffield after police officers noticed false number plates on his car. Inside the vehicle, they discovered tools that connected him to the series of murders. Further investigation revealed bloodstains, weapons, and other evidence that left little doubt as to his guilt. Once in custody, Sutcliffe confessed to many of the murders, speaking in a detached and almost casual manner that shocked investigators. He claimed that he had been commanded by voices, a supposed divine directive to rid the world of prostitutes. Whether this was a genuine delusion or an attempt to craft a defense is still debated, but it became a central element of his trial. In May 1981, Sutcliffe stood trial at the Old Bailey. The proceedings gripped the nation as the court heard testimony about the murders, the botched investigation, and Sutcliffe's mental state. His defense argued diminished responsibility, claiming he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, the jury rejected this, and Sutcliffe was convicted of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life terms in prison, a sentence later upgraded to a whole life tariff, ensuring that he would never be released. The aftermath of the case left lasting scars on British society. Families of the victims struggled with grief for decades, while the surviving victims bore the trauma of their attacks. The failures of the police investigation led to a major public inquiry, which criticized the West Yorkshire police for their mishandling of the case and recommended sweeping reforms. The Wearside Jack hoaxer was eventually unmasked and imprisoned years later, adding another tragic dimension to the story of misdirection and lost lives. Sutcliffe himself spent the rest of his life in custody, moving between prisons and psychiatric facilities. He was attacked several times by fellow inmates and lived under heavy guard. His health declined in later years, and he died in 2020 after contracting COVID-19, bringing an end to the life of a man whose crimes had cast a shadow over an entire generation. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most haunting chapters in British criminal history. It is a tale not only of violence and cruelty, but also of systemic failure, public fear, and the resilience of those who demanded justice. It reveals how the actions of one man can alter the lives of countless others, and how institutions meant to protect can falter under pressure. For decades, it has served as a cautionary reminder of the need for vigilance, fairness, and the protection of society's most vulnerable. Story 4. The story of Richard Ramirez, who would become infamously known as the Night Stalker, begins far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, in El Paso, Texas, where he was born in February 1960. He grew up in a troubled household, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father was strict and often abusive, and young Richard, called Richie by his family, began spending long hours away from home to avoid conflict. He slept in cemeteries as a child, he wandered the streets at night, and he grew up surrounded by influences that were anything but stable. From an early age, Ramirez was exposed to violence and darkness that would shape him forever. His older cousin, Miguel, was a Vietnam veteran who returned from the war with photographs of atrocities and stories of brutality. Miguel would show these images to the impressionable boy and brag about acts of violence he committed overseas. Even more horrifying, Miguel once shot his wife in front of Richard, an act of domestic murder that Ramirez witnessed firsthand as a teenager. This exposure to blood and death left a deep imprint. Ramirez's adolescence spiraled further into delinquency. He experimented with drugs, including LSD, and developed a fascination with Satanism, black magic, and horror. He idolized serial killers and murderers, studying their crimes as if they were role models. By his late teens, he was committing burglaries, drifting between jobs, and spending nights wandering city streets. Eventually, he left Texas for California, where the anonymity of Los Angeles provided the perfect landscape for his descent into crime. The wave of violence that earned him his place in history began in 1984. The first known murder linked to him was that of Jenny Vinkow, a 79-year-old woman who was brutally attacked in her Los Angeles apartment. Her death bore the hallmarks of the savagery that would characterize many of his crimes: forced entry, overwhelming violence, and sexual assault. At first, The murders seemed isolated, but within months, the pattern grew. In 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by terror. Ramirez embarked on a spree of home invasions, murders, rapes, and assaults that appeared almost random in their targets. He attacked the young and the elderly, men and women, people of different races and backgrounds. No one felt safe because there was no clear profile of who might be next. He entered homes at night, often through unlocked windows or doors, and his victims woke to unspeakable violence. Some were shot, others stabbed, many bludgeoned. He left behind scenes of horror that investigators struggled to connect at first, but soon the public and police alike realized they were facing one of the most sadistic criminals in modern American history. Ramirez developed a ritualistic pattern. He used guns, knives, or blunt objects. He often assaulted women sexually, sometimes in front of their partners or children. He forced his victims to swear to Satan, leaving behind pentagrams drawn in lipstick or carved into skin. The press seized on these satanic connections, fueling fear that the Night Stalker was not merely a murderer, but part of something even darker. The city of Los Angeles descended into paranoia. Hardware stores sold out of locks and guns. People double-bolted doors, installed alarms, and slept with weapons nearby. The heat of the summer in 1985 made this even more difficult, as residents kept their windows closed in fear. Every creak of the night became a cause for panic. The randomness of Ramirez's targets made him particularly terrifying. Unlike other killers who focused on specific types of victims, Ramirez struck without pattern, so no one felt safe. The police worked tirelessly, but Ramirez proved elusive. He used stolen cars, switched weapons, and left behind little that could lead directly to him. He killed in Los Angeles, but also traveled north to San Francisco, committing murders there as well, widening the scope of the hunt. A breakthrough came when a fingerprint lifted from a stolen car matched Richard Ramirez, whose criminal record included prior arrests. His face was soon plastered across newspapers and television screens, and the entire state knew his name. The capture of Richard Ramirez was almost cinematic in its drama. In August 1985, a resident in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from a newspaper photo. By chance, Ramirez had entered a local store and noticed his own face staring back at him from headlines. He attempted to flee, but was chased by a group of local residents. They cornered him, beat him, and held him down until police arrived. The Night Stalker had been brought down not by elite detectives, but by ordinary citizens who refused to let him escape. His trial was one of the most sensational in American history. Beginning in 1989, it stretched on for months, marked by shocking testimony, graphic evidence, and Ramirez's own disturbing behavior. He frequently flashed a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouted "Hail Satan" in court, and showed no remorse. His demeanor made him both feared and strangely idolized. Some followers wrote him love letters and attended his trial, drawn to his image as a dark antihero. But for the families of his victims, the trial was an agonizing ordeal, forcing them to relive the horrors inflicted by a man who seemed to revel in their pain. Ultimately, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury sentenced him to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Even in prison, Ramirez remained a figure of fascination and revulsion. He married a woman who had written to him while incarcerated, though their relationship eventually faded. He lived under the shadow of execution for more than 2 decades, appealing his conviction but never escaping his fate. In 2013, before his death sentence could be carried out, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma, ending his life behind bars. The legacy of Richard Ramirez's crimes is one of terror, sorrow, and unanswered questions. His victims and their families live with scars that never fully heal. The communities he terrorized remember the summer of 1985 as a time when fear was constant, when the Night Stalker seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His case also changed the way Americans understood crime, highlighting the vulnerability of ordinary households and the randomness of violence. The Night Stalker remains a chilling symbol of predatory cruelty, a man whose actions revealed the darkest corners of human capability. His story endures not because of who he was, but because of the devastating impact he had on countless innocent lives, and a reminder of how fragile safety can be when confronted with evil. Story 5. The story of Dennis Lynn Rader, who became known to the world as the BTK Killer, begins in the small city of Wichita, Kansas, a place that for many years felt far removed from the kind of horrors that would eventually unfold there. Dennis Rader was born in March of 1945 in the tiny community of Pittsburgh, Kansas, before his family eventually moved to Wichita. From the outside, he seemed to grow up in an ordinary Midwestern household, with both parents working hard to provide for their children. Yet even in his childhood, troubling patterns began to emerge. He later admitted that from a young age he experienced violent sexual fantasies, often imagining scenarios where he bound and controlled women. These fantasies never disappeared. Instead, they grew stronger as he matured, becoming the foundation for the crimes that would terrorize Kansas for decades. Rader graduated from high school in 1963 and spent a brief time in college before enlisting in the United States Air Force. He served from 1966 until 1970, and after returning to Kansas, he attempted to live what looked like an ordinary life. He married his wife Paula in 1971, settled down in the Wichita area, found steady work first in a meat packing plant and later with an outdoor supply company, and eventually became a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita. He was also active in his church congregation, even serving as president of the church council. To neighbors and colleagues, he seemed strict and somewhat odd, but far from dangerous. No one could have imagined the hidden life he was leading. The first known murders attributed to Rader occurred in January of 1974, when he entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero and two of their young children. What unfolded that morning was an act of unimaginable violence. Rader bound each member of the family with cords and methodically killed them one by one. The brutality of the Otero murders stunned Wichita and immediately led police to believe a highly dangerous individual was at large. Yet investigators had few leads. There were no suspects, no clear motive, and no connection between the victims and a possible killer. The Otero murders might have remained an isolated tragedy, but soon afterward Rader made it clear he wanted recognition. In October of 1970, a local newspaper received a letter from someone claiming responsibility. The letter described details of the crime scene that only the killer could know. Most chillingly, the writer signed the letter with the initials BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill. That phrase would become inseparable from the crimes and the identity of the man who committed them. Over the following years, Rader struck again. In April 1974, he killed Catherine Bright, a young woman he attacked in her home after following her. 2 years later, in March 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian, a mother whose children he locked in a bathroom while he carried out the crime. In December of that same year, he killed Nancy Fox, an attack he later called one of his most significant. Rader continued to taunt police and media through letters and poems, always signing them BTK. His communications revealed a desire for notoriety and control. He wanted to ensure his crimes would not be forgotten and that his name would instill fear. Despite the communications, investigators struggled to identify the killer. The crimes appeared carefully planned, and the letters revealed a disturbing intelligence. Task forces were formed, tips poured in, but the identity of BTK remained elusive. By the early 1980s, Rader seemed to go quiet. In reality, he had not stopped having violent fantasies, but he began spacing out his attacks, making them harder to connect. In April 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just down the street from him. He later confessed to hiding her body in the church where he served as council president, posing her in different positions before disposing of her remains. In September 1986, he killed Vicki Wegerle, leaving behind her husband as the one to find her bound and strangled. At the time, police did not realize this crime was connected to BTK, and it was only later confirmed through DNA evidence. His final known murder occurred in January 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, again abducting her from her home and leaving her body in a rural area outside Wichita. After that, Rader appeared to go dormant. For more than a decade, there were no known BTK murders, and many in Wichita began to believe the killer had either died or moved away. During this time, Rader continued living his outwardly normal life. He raised 2 children, maintained his job as a compliance officer where he enforced petty city codes with almost obsessive rigor, and remained active in his church. Those who knew him described him as strict, rule-bound, and somewhat controlling, but nothing that pointed to a secret double life as a serial killer. Then in 2004, more than 30 years after the first Otero murders, Wichita received a shock. BTK resurfaced. A local television station received a package containing photographs and a copy of Vicky Wedrell's driver's license, stolen from the crime scene years earlier. This was undeniable proof that the killer was still alive and wanted attention once again. Over the next year, a series of communications arrived at media outlets and police, all from BTK. He sent packages containing crime scene items, letters describing his actions, and puzzles meant to taunt investigators. These new communications proved to be Rader's undoing. In one package, he asked police if they could trace information from a computer floppy disk. Investigators responded publicly through a newspaper ad suggesting it would be safe. When Rader eventually sent a floppy disk, forensic analysis revealed metadata linking the document to Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis Rader. Investigators quickly confirmed that DNA taken from Rader's daughter matched evidence preserved from earlier crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested near his home in Park City. The news stunned the community. This man who had lived among them for decades, enforcing local codes and serving as a church leader, was now unmasked as the BTK killer. During interrogations, Rader calmly confessed to the murders, describing them in chilling detail. He showed no remorse, instead speaking about them as projects he had planned and executed. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, though he hinted at more crimes that could not be conclusively proven. In court, he pleaded guilty, giving a long and detailed confession that described each murder step by step. His demeanor was cold and matter-of-fact, horrifying the families of victims who listened in the courtroom. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains today. His case continues to be studied for the way he maintained a double life, the methods he used to communicate with the public and law enforcement, and the failures and eventual success of the investigation that captured him. The aftermath of the BTK case left lasting scars on Wichita. For decades, families had lived in fear, never knowing who among them might secretly be BTK. The revelation that he was an ordinary neighbor and community leader was almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Next story. The story of Eileen Wuornos begins not in the chaos of her crimes, but in the turbulence of her early childhood. She was born in February 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, to a teenage mother and a father who would never play a role in her life. Her father was a convicted child molester who ended up in prison, later taking his own life, and her mother abandoned Eileen and her brother when Eileen was only a toddler. The 2 children were left to the care of their grandparents, a home that was supposed to provide safety, but instead became another environment of instability and abuse. Eileen's grandfather was a violent man, and her grandmother struggled with alcoholism. From an early age, Eileen experienced neglect, violence, and exploitation. By the time she was 11 years old, she had already begun trading sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and small amounts of money, surviving in a world that offered her no protection. She became pregnant as a teenager after being assaulted, and her baby was given up for adoption. Soon after, she was expelled from her home, left to survive entirely on her own. Her teenage years unfolded on the margins of society. She hitchhiked across states, lived outdoors, and engaged in sex work to sustain herself. Eileen's life became a cycle of transient relationships, brushes with the law, and survival through whatever means she could find. She was arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and disorderly conduct. The years hardened her, stripping away any sense of stability or belonging. By the late 1980s, Wuornos was living in Florida, still drifting and surviving as a sex worker along highways. It was there, beginning in 1989, that her violent crimes began. Unlike many serial killers who targeted specific groups for twisted psychological reasons, Wuornos' murders were bound up with her own life circumstances. She claimed she killed men who had picked her up for sex when they became violent or attempted to assault her. But prosecutors would later argue her crimes were calculated robberies, carried out under the guise of self-defense. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old man who picked her up along a Florida highway. In December 1989, his body was discovered abandoned in his car, shot multiple times. At first, the murder seemed like an isolated case, but over the next year, more bodies appeared. The victims were all men, found along roadsides or in wooded areas, killed with a gun, and often robbed of their belongings or vehicles. As the body count rose, eventually reaching 7 confirmed murders, fear spread through Central Florida. Police connected the killings by the consistent method and by witness descriptions of a woman seen with some of the victims shortly before their deaths. A key detail helped narrow the search. Wuornos and her lover, Tyria Moore, had crashed one of the victims' cars and fled the scene, leaving behind fingerprints. Those prints were traced back to Wuornos, already known to law enforcement for her long history of arrests. Investigators began a manhunt, but Wuornos was elusive, moving from cheap motels to bars, living in constant motion. In January 1991, police finally caught her at a biker bar in Daytona Beach. She was arrested without incident, though she maintained a tough and defiant demeanor. Her partner, Tyria Moore, became a crucial figure in the case. Pressured by investigators, Moore agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. She called Wuornos while under police surveillance, persuading her to confess to the killings. On tape, Wuornos admitted to several murders, repeating her claim that she acted in self-defense against violent clients. Her trial became a national spectacle. In 1992, she was tried for the murder of Richard Mallory, though evidence from other killings was also introduced. The jury heard not only about the crimes, but also about her troubled past, her years of abandonment and abuse. Yet prosecutors argued that her pattern of taking money, possessions, and cars from her victims showed her true motive. After only a short deliberation, the jury found her guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, Wuornos faced additional trials for the other murders, each ending in further convictions and death sentences. She became one of the rare women on death row in the United States. Her demeanor in court was unpredictable. At times, she appeared calm and resigned. At other times, she lashed out, shouting at the judge, jury, or prosecutors, declaring her hatred for society and her belief that everyone was against her. Wuornos' story drew wide attention, not just because of her crimes, but because of the complicated questions they raised. Some saw her as a victim of abuse and exploitation, a woman who had been failed by every institution meant to protect her, whose violence was an extension of the violence inflicted upon her. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who preyed on men and used her history as an excuse. Her life and crimes became the subject of documentaries, books, and eventually the film Monster, which dramatized her story. But behind the media portrayal was a woman who lived nearly her entire life in pain, anger, and alienation. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. In her final moments, she gave a rambling statement, referencing outer space, Armageddon, and her belief that she would return. She died quickly, ending a life that had been marked from childhood by violence and instability. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos remains controversial. To some, she symbolizes how cycles of abuse and neglect can create a person capable of great harm. To others, she is remembered simply as a killer who took innocent lives. What is undeniable is that her story stands apart in the history of American crime. A rare example of a female serial killer whose crimes gripped the nation and left behind endless debate about justice, responsibility, and the roots of violence. Her life reminds us how deeply environment and trauma can shape a person, but also how society struggles to reconcile sympathy with accountability. For her victims and their families, the question of motive mattered little compared to the irreversible loss they suffered. For true crime history, the name Aileen Wuornos remains forever etched as both a cautionary tale and a chilling story of violence born from a life of suffering. Next story. The story of John Wayne Gacy begins in the suburbs of Chicago, where he was born in March 1942 to a working-class family. From the outside, his childhood seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors, life was harsh and unforgiving. His father was an alcoholic with a violent temper who regularly belittled and beat him. His mother, though more nurturing, could not shield him from the constant abuse. Gacy grew up desperate for approval, especially from his father, yet he rarely received anything but criticism. As a child, Gacy suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his physical activity. He often felt like an outsider, excluded from sports, and overshadowed by his father's disdain. But beneath his fragile health and troubled home life, Gacy began developing the traits that would later define him: charm, manipulation, and a hunger for recognition. By his teenage years, Gacy began finding ways to fit in socially. He was known as friendly and eager to help, often volunteering for school and community projects. But his personal life already carried shadows. He struggled with his sexuality, something he kept hidden at a time when homosexuality was harshly judged. His need to maintain a public image while concealing his private desires would become a recurring theme throughout his life. In early adulthood, Gacy drifted into sales and business management, where his charisma proved useful. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and capable of winning people over. But cracks appeared quickly. In the 1960s, after marrying and moving to Iowa, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He served time in prison, where he earned a reputation as a model inmate, and was released after serving only a portion of his sentence. His wife divorced him during his incarceration, taking their children and leaving him to start over. When Gacy returned to Illinois, he reinvented himself. He became a contractor, starting his own business and employing local young men. He became active in Democratic Party politics, even posing for photographs with prominent politicians. He volunteered in the community, organizing parties and entertaining children while dressed as Pogo the Clown, a character he created. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed generous and dependable, a man who gave back to his community. But behind this mask, Gacy was living a double life of unimaginable horror. From 1972 to 1978, he lured dozens of young men and teenage boys to his home. Some were employees, others were hitchhikers or runaways, and some simply disappeared after meeting him. Once inside, Gacy used various ruses to trap his victims, including a so-called magic trick where he handcuffed them under the pretense of showing them an escape trick. What followed was torture, sexual assault, and murder. The scale of his crimes would not be fully understood until years later. Gacy disposed of many of his victims by burying them in the crawl space beneath his suburban home. When that space became overcrowded, he began discarding bodies in the Des Plaines River. For years, his murders went unnoticed, hidden by his outward image of respectability and civic involvement. Suspicion began to mount in 1978 after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, who was last seen leaving work to meet Gacy about a potential job. When police investigated, they quickly connected Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A background check revealed his prior conviction for sexual assault, raising alarm. Detectives began surveillance on Gacy, following him around the clock. As they built their case, they gathered witness statements and evidence linking him to other missing young men. The pressure mounted, and Gacy, increasingly paranoid, began drinking heavily and confiding strange things to friends. In December 1978, police executed a search warrant at Gacy's home. What they found was overwhelming. Beneath the house, investigators uncovered a gruesome burial ground. One body after another was exhumed, eventually totaling 29 victims buried on his property, with additional bodies recovered from the nearby river. The revelations shocked the nation. Gacy, the man who had dressed as a clown for children's parties and mingled with politicians, was now revealed as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The contrast between his public persona and his hidden crimes made the case unforgettable. Gacy was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial began in 1980 and quickly became a media sensation. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including confessions Gacy had made during interrogation and the remains of victims discovered in his crawl space. The defense attempted to argue that Gacy was insane, claiming he had multiple personalities and that one of them, not the man himself, had committed the murders. The jury was not convinced. After a short deliberation, Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, one of the highest confirmed victim counts for a single killer in the United States. He was sentenced to death. For more than a decade, Gacy remained on death row, filing appeals and granting interviews. In these interviews, he alternated between admitting guilt, denying involvement, and even blaming others. He painted himself as a scapegoat, a victim of lies, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final meal consisted of fried chicken, shrimp, and strawberries, and his final words were defiant, a reflection of the arrogance that had marked much of his life. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy is one of horror and betrayal. He was a man who hid his darkest crimes behind the painted smile of a clown, deceiving his community while committing acts of unspeakable violence. His case forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of facades, that a man who entertains children can also be capable of burying their peers beneath his own home. The Gacy murders remain a landmark case in American criminal history, a chilling reminder of how deception and cruelty can coexist within one person. For the families of his victims, the story is not about the bizarre details of his double life, but about the young lives cut short and the years of pain that followed. Even today, the name John Wayne Gacy evokes both fear and fascination, a symbol of hidden darkness and the limits of trust. His crawl space became a graveyard, his home a house of horrors, and his name one of the most infamous in the history of crime. Next story. The story of Richard Ramirez begins on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. From early childhood, Ramirez's life was scarred by violence and instability. His father, a former police officer in Mexico turned laborer in the United States, had a harsh temper. He frequently lashed out at his children, instilling fear rather than guidance. Richard was different from the start, prone to seizures and suffering from head injuries after repeated blows to the head. He struggled in school and became withdrawn. As a boy, he often slept in cemeteries to escape his father's wrath, finding comfort in the stillness of the night. But what might have been a shy, troubled boy soon began sliding towards something darker. A major influence in Ramirez's life was his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who returned home deeply scarred by combat. Miguel shared stories of brutal violence and even showed Richard photographs of Vietnamese women he claimed to have assaulted and killed. He glorified cruelty, and to a young Richard, these stories became lessons rather than warnings. When Richard was just 13, he witnessed Miguel shoot and kill his own wife during a domestic argument. Instead of recoiling from the horror, Ramirez seemed fascinated, absorbing it as part of his twisted education. By his teenage years, Ramirez had begun experimenting with drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD, while developing an obsession with Satanism. He gravitated toward darker influences in music, art, and literature. Petty crime became a routine, and he eventually dropped out of high school. He left Texas for California, where he slipped into a transient lifestyle of theft, drugs, and aimlessness. But behind the theft and wandering, a darker compulsion was growing, a drive for violence and domination. In 1984, Ramirez began what would become one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. His first known murder occurred that June, when he attacked a 79-year-old woman in her apartment, stabbing her repeatedly. Soon, his crimes escalated. Unlike many killers who targeted a specific type of victim, Ramirez attacked randomly. His victims included men, women, and children, ranging from young girls to elderly couples. He would break into homes at night, assault his victims, commit sexual violence, and often kill them with knives or guns. The randomness of his crimes made him uniquely terrifying. No neighborhood felt safe. Families locked their doors, bolted their windows, and slept in fear. The press began calling him the Night Stalker, a name that stuck and magnified the sense of dread. Ramirez reveled in the fear he created. During his attacks, he invoked Satan, leaving behind symbols and shouting phrases that amplified his image as a disciple of evil. He often forced his victims to swear loyalty to Satan or mock their faith. His methods were cruel and chaotic, sometimes shooting his victims, sometimes stabbing them, sometimes bludgeoning them. Survivors described him as tall, thin, with rotting teeth, smelling of decay, and having eyes that radiated menace. By the summer of 1985, California was in a panic. Ramirez's attacks stretched across Los Angeles and later into the San Francisco Bay Area. Communities set up neighborhood watches, police patrols increased, and gun sales soared. The randomness of his crimes left investigators scrambling. But Ramirez made mistakes. He left fingerprints, shoe prints, and eyewitness descriptions. A stolen car he abandoned eventually gave police the evidence they needed. In August 1985, his fingerprint was matched to a prior arrest record, and his identity was released to the public. His mugshot was printed on the front pages of newspapers across California. Only days later, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles and realized that everyone around him recognized his face. Panicked, he tried to steal a car and escape, but the local community chased him down. In a dramatic moment of street justice, a mob of citizens beat and restrained him until police arrived. The reign of the Night Stalker had ended, not at the hands of detectives, but by ordinary people who refused to let him escape. Ramirez was put on trial in 1989 for 13 murders, as well as charges of attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The trial was a media circus, drawing massive crowds. Ramirez appeared in court with long hair, dark sunglasses, and a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouting, "Hail Satan." His behavior shocked many, reinforcing the image of a man who embraced evil as an identity. The trial dragged on for years due to its complexity and the number of charges. Survivors and families of victims gave heart-wrenching testimony. Forensic evidence tied Ramirez directly to multiple crimes. Despite his lawyer's attempts, the jury found him guilty on all major counts. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. Upon hearing the sentence, he sneered and told the court that death was nothing compared to the forces he served, declaring that the real terror would come later. Ramirez was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained on death row for more than 2 decades. During his imprisonment, he developed a following of admirers, some drawn to his notoriety, others captivated by his embrace of Satanism. In 1996, he even married a freelance magazine editor who had become obsessed with him. But his life ended not with execution, but with illness. On June 7, 2013, at the age of 53, Richard Ramirez died of complications related to lymphoma while still awaiting execution. The Night Stalker case remains one of the most infamous in American history. Ramirez's crimes were not only about murder, but about terror itself, striking randomly, violating the sanctity of homes, and leaving behind communities paralyzed with fear. He embodied the nightmare of a predator who could come for anyone, at any time, without reason or pattern. For Californians who lived through that summer of 1985, the memory of locking doors, checking windows, and listening for noises in the dark remains vivid. Richard Ramirez left scars not only on his victims and their families, but on an entire state that lived under his shadow. His name has since become synonymous with pure, predatory evil. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the darkest chapters in modern crime history. Born in May 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey grew up in a home that was outwardly normal but internally fractured. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, battled her own struggles with mental health. From a young age, Jeffrey displayed signs of detachment from those around him. He was shy, withdrawn, and often preferred to be alone. What stood out to those who later reflected on his youth was a fascination with the dead and with animals in particular. Jeffrey would collect roadkill, study the bodies, and experiment with their bones. At the time, these habits were dismissed as odd, but not alarming enough to demand intervention. As Jeffrey entered his teenage years, his isolation deepened. Alcohol became his companion. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours, hiding liquor in the folds of his clothing or stashing it in lockers. His classmates sometimes laughed about it, but his drinking was a symptom of a deeper emptiness that was consuming him. He felt disconnected from people. At the same time, Jeffrey was beginning to struggle with his own sexual identity, and he later admitted that his urges were mixed with fantasies of control and domination. The pivotal moment that marked his first descent into murder came in June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation. His parents had separated, and Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. One evening, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Stephen was a young man heading to a rock concert, and he accepted Jeffrey's invitation to stop at the house for some drinks. At first, the atmosphere was friendly, but as the night wore on, Jeffrey realized that Stephen wanted to leave. Panic and desperation filled him because Jeffrey did not want to be alone again. He struck Stephen with a dumbbell and strangled him. This was the first murder. Afterward, Jeffrey dismembered the body and disposed of it in the woods behind the house. This act haunted him, but it also awakened something inside him that he would later admit he could not control. In the years that followed, Jeffrey tried to appear normal. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after only a few months. His drinking worsened, and his father forced him to enlist in the Army in 1979. Jeffrey trained as a medic in Germany. While stationed overseas, he continued to drink excessively. Some later reports suggested that he may have assaulted fellow soldiers, though these cases were never pursued in detail at the time. By 1981, he was discharged for his inability to function. With no stable direction, Jeffrey drifted between relatives and odd jobs. By the late 1980s, his impulses returned stronger. Living in Milwaukee in a small apartment, Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses. At first, he sought companionship, but his fear of abandonment twisted these encounters. He started drugging men to keep them unconscious during their encounters. Eventually, this progressed into murder once again. In 1987, he killed Stephen Twomey in a hotel room after a night of drinking. Jeffrey later claimed he awoke to find Stephen dead without memory of killing him, but this pattern of blackout, followed by violence, would repeat. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer embarked on a spree that would claim 16 more lives. His method was chillingly systematic. He lured young men and boys, often from marginalized communities, with promises of money or photographs. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies for days. In some cases, he performed disturbing rituals of dismemberment and cannibalism. He kept skulls and body parts as trophies, storing them in his refrigerator in a blue barrel filled with acid. His obsession was not only with killing, but with creating a permanent companion who could never leave him. He attempted crude experiments of drilling holes into the skulls of victims and injecting chemicals in hopes of creating a compliant zombie-like partner. Despite the horror unfolding inside his apartment, Jeffrey remained surprisingly unnoticed. Several near escapes highlight the tragic failures of authorities. One of the most striking occurred in May 1991 when a 14-year-old boy named Conorak, sent the some phone, managed to flee Jeffrey's apartment drugged and bleeding. Neighbors called police when they saw the boy wandering incoherently. Officers arrived, but Jeffrey convinced them that Conorak was his adult lover and that it was a private matter. The police accepted this explanation and left the boy in Jeffrey's custody. Within an hour, Jeffrey had killed him. These failures allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes until July 22nd, 1991, when another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Edwards was lured to the apartment, but once inside, he noticed the smell and saw the strange surroundings. Jeffrey attempted to handcuff him, but Edwards fought back and fled through the door. He stopped police officers on patrol and led them back to the apartment. When police entered, they discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, and soon after, the full extent of Jeffrey's actions was revealed. The arrest shocked the nation. Neighbors who had complained of foul smells and odd noises were horrified to learn what had been happening next door. The investigation uncovered remains of multiple victims, as well as the tools and containers Jeffrey had used. His calm demeanor during questioning unsettled investigators. He openly admitted to the murders, describing his rituals in clinical detail. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. Many of them were already living in difficult social and economic circumstances and now had to endure the public exposure of their loved ones' deaths. The trial began in January 1992 and drew international attention. Jeffrey pleaded guilty but insane. His defense argued that his mental illness drove his uncontrollable urges. The prosecution maintained that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he carefully planned his actions. After weeks of testimony, including graphic evidence, the jury found him guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms totaling nearly 1,000 years in prison. Prison did not bring peace. Jeffrey initially lived quietly behind bars, reading the Bible and speaking to chaplains. Yet other inmates viewed him with contempt. He sometimes mocked guards and prisoners by shaping his food into body parts, as if to relive his crimes. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver beat him to death in the prison bathroom. For many families, this ending felt like a final chapter, though it could never erase the pain. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to stir debates about mental illness policing and the vulnerability of marginalized groups. His crimes revealed systemic failures in law enforcement, who dismissed the concerns of neighbors and ignored the pleas of victims. It showed how predators can hide in plain sight, while institutions fail to protect those most at risk. Documentaries and books continue to analyze the case, but beyond the sensationalism lies the human cost. 17 lives were lost, each with families who still mourn. Story 2. Ted Bundy remains a name etched into the darkest pages of criminal history. Born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Bundy grew up in an environment of secrets. His mother, Eleanor, raised him with the support of her strict parents. For a time, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents, and his mother was his sister. The truth of his parentage remained confusing, and he grew up with an undercurrent of instability. Despite this, outwardly, he appeared intelligent, polite, and even charming. As a young boy, Bundy displayed early signs of detachment and fascination with control. Neighbors recalled that he sometimes placed knives around his aunt as she slept. He also developed a habit of peeping into windows and stealing items from homes. Still, these warning signs went largely unnoticed. He was a good student and seemed socially adept. Teachers saw him as quiet and well-mannered. In the 1960s, Bundy attended the University of Washington in Seattle. There he studied psychology and became politically active, volunteering for campaigns and working a crisis hotline. Colleagues at the hotline would later recall his calm voice and apparent empathy for callers in distress. Nobody suspected that he was already harboring violent fantasies. Bundy's murders began in the early 1970s, though it is believed he may have killed earlier. He targeted young women, often students who resembled a former girlfriend he felt deeply rejected by. He would approach them in public places pretending to be injured or in need of help. Sometimes he wore a sling or used crutches. When kind strangers offered assistance, he would lead them to a secluded area and attack. His earliest confirmed victims were in Washington state. In 1974, a series of disappearances began to alarm police. Women vanished from college campuses, leaving little trace. One of the first was Linda, an Healy, a student at the University of Washington, who disappeared from her home in January 1974. That summer, two women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared on the same day from Lake Sammamish State Park. Witnesses described a handsome man with a cast on his arm asking women to help him load a sailboat. He introduced himself as Ted. This was one of the first times investigators had a name. Bundy's ability to charm and deceive allowed him to evade suspicion. He continued his studies, even attending law school. Outwardly, he dated women, maintained friendships, and volunteered in politics. Yet beneath this mask, his killings escalated. He abducted, raped, and murdered women across multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His method was consistent. He lured victims, often at night, assaulted them, and killed them usually by strangulation or bludgeoning. He sometimes revisited the bodies, leaving them in remote wooded areas, and in some cases committing acts of necrophilia. By 1975, Bundy had moved to Utah, and killings began there as well. Local investigators grew alarmed at the pattern. He was eventually arrested that year after police found burglary tools in his car, which also contained suspicious items like handcuffs and a ski mask. At the time, this evidence was not enough for a murder charge, but it marked the beginning of his downfall. Bundy managed to escape custody multiple times, which only added to his infamy. In 1977, while held in Colorado, he leapt from a courthouse library window and fled. He was recaptured, but later that year, he escaped again from his jail cell by squeezing through a hole in the ceiling. He made his way across the country to Florida. In Florida, Bundy unleashed his most brutal attacks. In January 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, he attacked 4 women in their rooms, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and severely injuring the others. Only weeks later, he abducted and murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. These crimes shocked the nation and ended any illusion that Bundy was a man who could restrain himself. His capture came soon after. In February 1978, he was pulled over by police in Pensacola driving a stolen car. Once identified, his face was splashed across newspapers nationwide. The trial that followed was the first to be televised, and millions watched as Bundy attempted to defend himself in court. He cross-examined witnesses and played the role of his own lawyer. His charm and arrogance fascinated the media, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite mark analysis tied him to the Chi Omega murders, and witnesses placed him near the scenes. In 1979, Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. Additional trials followed for the murder of Kimberly Leach, and he received another death sentence. Over the next decade, he lived on death row in Florida, appealing his case and granting interviews. During this time, he confessed to more than 30 murders, though investigators believe the true number may be higher, possibly over 100. Bundy described in chilling detail how he selected and killed his victims. In January 1989, his appeals ran out, and he was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, the prison crowds gathered, chanting and celebrating the end of his life. For many families, the execution closed a painful chapter, though the scars of loss remained. The legacy of Ted Bundy endures because his crimes revealed how easily appearances can deceive. He was educated, articulate, and outwardly normal, yet beneath that facade lay a predator driven by compulsion. His case led to greater awareness of a need for coordinated police work across states, since Bundy moved freely between jurisdictions. It also highlighted the vulnerability of young women who trusted a stranger in need. Today, Bundy is remembered not only for his crimes, but also for the way society responded to him. The media often portrayed him as charismatic, which drew criticism for humanizing him instead of focusing on the victims. Books, documentaries, and films continue to analyze his life, but at the core remain the stories of the women whose lives were stolen. They were daughters, sisters, and friends who deserve remembrance beyond the shadow of the man who killed them. Bundy's story is one of deception, manipulation, and cruelty wrapped in the mask of normalcy. It endures as a warning that evil can sometimes wear the most ordinary face. Story 3. John Wayne Gacy was born in March 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a working-class family with a father who was an alcoholic and physically abusive. His childhood was marked by fear and insecurity. Though he tried to please his father, nothing ever seemed enough. He suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his activities. These early years shaped a man who longed for acceptance, but carried deep resentment and anger inside. Despite a difficult home life, Gacy worked hard to present himself as normal. In high school, he was not particularly athletic, but he participated in clubs and worked odd jobs. He developed an early interest in politics and community activities. After leaving school, he married and tried to build a stable life. For a time, he seemed successful. He managed several fast food restaurants and became involved in local organizations. His outward personality was friendly and generous. He hosted neighborhood gatherings and was known to dress as a clown named Pogo to entertain children at hospitals and community events. This image of the cheerful neighbor and community volunteer would later stand in sharp contrast to the darkness he hid. Beneath the mask of normalcy, Gacy was leading a double life. He had already faced accusations of assaulting young men in the 1960s while living in Iowa. He was convicted of sexually abusing a teenage boy in 1968 and sentenced to prison. Though he served less than 2 years, he returned to Chicago with a record that should have been a warning. Instead, he managed to rebuild his reputation. He remarried, started his own construction business, and became active in local politics. He was even photographed with prominent politicians. To the public, he was a respected businessman. To those closest to him, there were glimpses of volatility, but few suspected the horror that lay hidden. Gacy's crimes escalated in the early 1970s. He lured young men and boys to his home, often offering them work construction jobs or simply a safe place to hang out. Once inside his modest suburban house, he would overpower them. His method became ritualistic. He used handcuffs, sometimes presenting them as a party trick. After restraining his victims, he would assault, torture, and eventually strangle them. Most of the killings took place in his home while his neighbors remained unaware. The number of victims grew over the years. Gacy buried many of them in the crawl space beneath his house. Others were disposed of in nearby rivers. The smell in the house became overwhelming at times, but Gacy explained it away as plumbing issues. He continued to maintain his outward image of normality, attending parties, working in politics, and performing as Pogo the Clown. The juxtaposition between his community role and his secret life made the eventual revelation all the more shocking. In 1978, his crimes began to unravel. That December, a teenage boy named Robert Pius disappeared after telling friends he was going to meet a contractor about a job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When police began investigating, they quickly connected Gacy to other missing young men. They obtained a search warrant and entered his house. Inside, they found items that belonged to several missing victims. The stench from the crawl space raised immediate suspicions. A second search warrant allowed police to dig beneath the house. What they uncovered was a nightmare. Body after body was exhumed from the crawl space. In total, 29 victims were buried there, with additional remains found in rivers nearby. Many of the victims were teenagers or young men who had simply vanished without explanation. For families who had searched desperately for answers, the discovery was devastating. Gacy was arrested and interrogated. His demeanor shocked investigators. He confessed calmly to more than 30 murders, describing his methods in chilling detail. He admitted that he had sometimes killed 2 victims in a single night. He spoke of the killings as though they were routine parts of his life. His lack of remorse and the sheer scale of his crimes stunned even seasoned detectives. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began in 1980. It attracted enormous attention. Prosecutors laid out the evidence of his double life and the brutality of his murders. The defense attempted to argue insanity, but the jury was unconvinced. The calculated nature of his crimes and his ability to maintain a normal outward life demonstrated that he understood his actions. After only a short deliberation, the jury found him guilty on 33 counts of murder. It was one of the largest conviction totals for a single person in American history at the time. Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. During this time, he painted hundreds of portraits, many of them depicting clowns. These paintings were sometimes sold at auctions, sparking controversy. Gacy gave interviews in which he denied responsibility despite his earlier confessions. He claimed he was the victim of a conspiracy. His shifting stories only added to his notoriety. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Outside, the prison crowds gathered in celebration. For many families, the execution brought some closure, though nothing could restore the lives that were lost. The sheer scale of his crimes left a permanent scar on the communities he had haunted. The case of John Wayne Gacy continues to resonate because of the contrast between his public and private lives. He was the friendly neighbor, the businessman, the clown who entertained children, yet behind closed doors, he was a predator who murdered more than 30 young men. His ability to hide in plain sight exposed flaws in the system and highlighted how vulnerable runaway teens and young workers were in the 1970s. The legacy of Gacy is one of horror and deception. His crimes serve as a reminder that appearances can be misleading and that predators can exist even in the most ordinary neighborhoods. The memory of his victims endures as a testament to lives cut short by a man who wore a mask, both literal and figurative. Behind the smile of a clown lay the heart of a killer. Story 4. The Zodiac Killer is a name that still casts a shadow over the history of American crime. Active in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Northern California, the Zodiac terrorized communities with brutal murders and cryptic letters. Unlike many other killers, his identity was never confirmed, which has only deepened the mystery and fear surrounding the case. The first confirmed attack attributed to the Zodiac occurred on December 20th, 1968, near the small town of Benicia, California. Two teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were on their first date when they parked at a lover's lane spot. A car pulled up beside them. The assailant forced them out and shot both of them with a handgun. Betty Lou died instantly, and David was mortally wounded. There was no robbery or clear motive. It seemed a senseless act. Investigators had few leads, and the case went cold. On July 4th, 1969, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were sitting in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo when a vehicle pulled up. The driver left, then returned and opened fire with a handgun. Darlene was killed, and Mike survived with serious injuries. Just over an hour later, a man called the Vallejo police station claiming responsibility not only for this attack, but also for the previous one on David and Betty Lou. The caller provided details that had not been released publicly. It was the first direct communication from the man who would call himself the Zodiac. Weeks later, newspapers received letters written by the killer. These letters were taunting, filled with strange symbols and coded messages. In one, he introduced himself with the chilling phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." He demanded that the letters be published or he would kill more people. Inside the letters were cryptograms that he claimed revealed his identity. One of the first ciphers was cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife. It did not reveal a name, but instead a disturbing message where the killer declared that he enjoyed killing because it was fun. The Zodiac struck again on September 27, 1969 at Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing by the water when a man approached wearing a hood with a crosshair symbol on the chest. He tied them up and stabbed them repeatedly. Brian survived, but Cecilia later died. Before leaving the scene, the attacker scrawled a message on the victim's car door with the dates of his previous attacks and his distinctive crosshair symbol. Only 2 weeks later, on October 11th, 1969, the Zodiac murdered cab driver Paul Stein in San Francisco. He shot him in the head and then bizarrely cut a piece of the victim's shirt to send later with a letter. Witnesses saw the killer at the scene, describing him as a white male in his 30s with glasses. Despite this near miss, the Zodiac managed to escape into the night. Police rushed to the area, but confusion about the suspect's race led officers to let him walk past them. This mistake may have cost them their best chance at capture. Over the following years, the Zodiac continued to send letters to newspapers and police. In them, he mocked investigators, boasted about his crimes, and threatened mass killings. He claimed responsibility for dozens of murders, though only a handful have been definitively linked to him. The letters often included ciphers, some of which remain unsolved to this day. His messages revealed a man who craved attention and control more than anything. He wanted to be feared and to prove that he was smarter than the authorities. The investigation into the Zodiac was massive. Police departments across multiple counties worked together, but cooperation was strained at times. Thousands of tips poured in and hundreds of suspects were investigated. The most famous suspect was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who lived in Vallejo and matched some descriptions. He was interviewed multiple times and even named in a search warrant. Circumstantial evidence pointed toward him, but definitive proof never surfaced. DNA analysis years later did not match him, though doubts and debates remain. As time passed, the Zodiac's letters grew less frequent. His last confirmed correspondence was in 1974. After that, the trail went cold. Some believe he died or was imprisoned for another crime. Others think he simply stopped writing and continued living quietly under a false identity. The lack of closure left victims' families and investigators frustrated. In the decades since the killings, the Zodiac has become part of American folklore. Books, documentaries, and films have kept the story alive. Amateur sleuths have dedicated their lives to decoding his ciphers and piecing together clues. In 2020, a team of codebreakers finally solved one of his unsolved ciphers sent in 1969. The message contained more taunts, but again, no name. This reinforced the idea that the Zodiac never intended to reveal his identity. His goal was to manipulate the public and instill fear. The impact of the Zodiac case was profound. It highlighted the challenges of interagency cooperation in the pre-digital era, when communication between counties was slow. It showed how media attention could both aid and hinder investigations. The constant publication of his letters gave him the spotlight he desired, but also kept the public informed. To this day, the identity of the Zodiac remains unproven. DNA analysis offers some hope, but the evidence is limited and degraded by time. Theories abound, ranging from known suspects like Arthur Lee Allen to more obscure figures. Every few years, a new claim emerges about his identity, but none have been confirmed. The story of the Zodiac killer endures because it combines brutal violence with mystery. Unlike other serial killers who were eventually caught and exposed, the Zodiac remains a ghost figure lurking in the shadows of history. His victims were ordinary people, young couples enjoying evenings by the water, or a cab driver working late at night. Their lives were cut short by a man who wanted to be remembered for terror rather than for who he was. Today, more than 50 years later, the case continues to fascinate because it is unfinished. The unanswered questions leave space for endless speculation. The Zodiac's cryptic symbols remain as haunting reminders of a killer who manipulated fear with both weapons and words. His legacy is not only in the murders he committed, but in the way he exploited mystery itself, turning crime into a dark puzzle that is yet to be solved. Story 5. Richard Ramirez was born in February 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by instability and violence. His father was strict and often abusive. His mother worked in a factory where exposure to chemicals may have affected her health. Richard grew up surrounded by poverty and dysfunction. From a young age, he was influenced by his older cousin Miguel, who had returned from serving in Vietnam. Miguel boasted about brutal acts he had committed during the war and even showed Richard disturbing photographs of women he claimed to have assaulted. At only 12 years old, Richard witnessed Miguel murder his own wife during a domestic argument. These traumatic experiences left deep scars on the boy, who was already vulnerable. Richard began experimenting with drugs as a teenager, turning to marijuana and later LSD. He also developed a fascination with Satanism and dark rituals. He struggled in school and dropped out early. His petty crimes soon escalated into burglaries. By his early 20s, he had moved to California, drifting through Los Angeles and San Francisco, surviving on theft and immersing himself in a lifestyle of addiction and violence. His descent into murder began in 1984. That June, a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vinkow was found dead in her apartment in Los Angeles. She had been stabbed, and her body showed signs of mutilation. Police had no suspect at the time, but years later this crime was linked to Richard Ramirez. It marked the start of his killing spree. By 1985, the murders escalated dramatically. Ramirez gained the nickname the Night Stalker because he attacked in the middle of the night. He targeted homes across Southern California, breaking in while victims slept. His methods were unpredictable. Sometimes he used a gun, other times a knife or blunt objects. He killed men and women of all ages. He assaulted women and sometimes children. He left satanic symbols at crime scenes and forced victims to swear their loyalty to the devil. The randomness of his attacks created widespread fear because nobody knew who might be next. In March 1985, he attacked Maria Hernandez in her home in Rosemead. She survived by raising her hands and deflecting a bullet. Minutes later, he killed another woman, Tsai, leaving you outside her car nearby. That same evening, he killed a third woman in her apartment. These rapid attacks terrified the city. Newspapers began covering the Night Stalker daily. Over the next months, Ramirez continued his spree. He invaded homes across Los Angeles and beyond, often leaving survivors who could describe his appearance. He was tall, thin, with rotting teeth and a foul odor that witnesses never forgot. His brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. In some cases, he forced couples to witness each other's assaults before killing one or both. He showed no consistent pattern except his desire to terrorize. The police struggled to catch him. At first, the crime seemed unrelated because of the varying weapons and methods. But soon detectives connected the attacks by shoe prints left behind. A distinct sneaker pattern linked multiple scenes. The media reported on this detail, which angered investigators because Ramirez could have changed his shoes to avoid detection. Still, the clue remained vital. By the summer of 1985, his crimes reached a peak. He attacked in San Francisco, killing Peter and Barbara Pan in their home. The mayor of San Francisco publicly revealed that the killer used a .22 caliber handgun. Ramirez read the papers constantly and adjusted his tactics to confuse police. But mistakes piled up. Survivors gave detailed descriptions, and eventually a fingerprint was lifted from a stolen car he abandoned. Police matched it to Richard Ramirez, who already had a record for theft and drug charges. On August 31st, 1985, Ramirez was finally captured, but not by police at first. His photograph had been released to the public, and when he attempted to steal a car in East Los Angeles, he was recognized. Neighbors chased him through the streets and cornered him. The crowd beat him until police arrived to take him into custody. The capture brought relief to a city that had been living in fear for months. The trial of Richard Ramirez became one of the most notorious in American history. It began in 1989 and lasted over a year. The courtroom was often filled with reporters and curious spectators. Ramirez seemed to revel in the attention. He flashed satanic hand signs and shouted "Hail Satan" during proceedings. His gaunt appearance, dark eyes, and defiant attitude made him a figure of morbid fascination. Despite his behavior, the evidence was overwhelming. Survivors testified in detail. Forensic evidence, including fingerprints and ballistic matches, tied him to multiple murders. In September 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, as well as numerous counts of assault, burglary, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin prison. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered the verdict. Families of victims wept both in grief and in relief that justice had been served. On death row, Ramirez continued to attract media attention. He received letters from admirers and even married a woman who believed in his innocence. His presence remained unsettling. Unlike some killers who eventually expressed remorse, he showed none. He continued to speak about Satanism and portrayed himself as an outcast who had embraced evil. Ramirez never faced execution. He remained on death row for more than 2 decades. In June 2013, he died of complications related to cancer at the age of 53. For some, the fact that he died of natural causes rather than execution was frustrating, but his death finally closed the chapter on his life. The legacy of the Night Stalker remains one of pure terror. His crimes were random, cruel, and driven not by need, but by a desire to spread fear. Unlike killers who targeted specific types of victims, Ramirez attacked anyone he encountered. This unpredictability magnified the panic in California communities. People began locking doors, installing new security systems, and staying awake at night terrified that he might strike. His story highlights the vulnerability of ordinary homes and the way one man can paralyze entire cities. The survivors of his attacks continue to carry the memories of those nights. The families of the dead live with the loss of loved ones whose lives were cut short in acts of senseless brutality. Richard Ramirez remains a reminder of the darkest extremes of human behavior. He called himself a servant of Satan, but in reality, he was a predator who preyed on the innocent. His name and the moniker Night Stalker endure in American memory as symbols of fear that once gripped a generation. Story 6. In the quiet rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, during the first half of the 20th century, life moved slowly and simply. The community was small, neighbors knew one another, and farms stretched across the flat landscape. Yet behind this peaceful setting there lived a man whose crimes would eventually horrify the entire nation. His name was Edward Theodore Gain. Ed Gain was born in August 1906 to George and Augusta Gain. His father was an alcoholic who struggled to hold steady work, while his mother was deeply religious, domineering, and strict. Augusta instilled in her two sons a belief that the world was filled with sin and corruption. She particularly warned them against women, describing them as instruments of immorality. Ed grew up isolated. The family rarely allowed social interaction, and the Gain children were discouraged from making friends. As a child, Ed was shy, quiet, and awkward. He was ridiculed by other children at school, which only pushed him further into isolation. His mother's teachings shaped him profoundly. He developed an unhealthy attachment to Augusta, viewing her as the only pure and trustworthy person in the world. This dependence would define his entire life. In 1940, Ed's father died, leaving the family to survive on farm income. Soon after, his older brother Henry began expressing doubts about their mother's strict worldview. Henry worried about Ed's unhealthy devotion to Augusta, but in 1944 Henry died in a suspicious fire while working on the family property. Although the official cause was listed as asphyxiation, investigators quietly noted that the circumstances were odd. Ed reported the fire, and when Henry's body was found, it appeared not badly burned, leading some to wonder if Ed had played a role in his brother's death. After Henry's passing, Ed was left alone with his mother. But only a year later, in 1945, Augusta herself died following a series of strokes. Her death devastated Ed. He had lost the one person who dominated his world and provided structure to his life. Without her guidance, he became reclusive, retreating into the farmhouse that grew increasingly filthy and cluttered. Most rooms were left untouched as shrines to Augusta, kept exactly as she had left them, while Ed confined himself to a few areas filled with debris and decay. It was in this lonely environment that Ed's obsession with death and the human body began to take its most disturbing form. He frequently visited cemeteries at night, digging up recently buried bodies. He removed skin, bones, and organs, taking them back to his farmhouse where he fashioned grotesque trophies. Investigators later discovered masks made of human skin, bowls crafted from skulls, and furniture upholstered with human hides. These creations suggested that Ed was attempting to recreate his mother's presence or even become her by wearing the skin of women he exhumed. For many years, his macabre activities went unnoticed. Plainfield was a small, trusting community, and Ed was seen as odd but harmless. He worked odd jobs, babysat for neighbors, and was known for being polite though strange. That perception changed in November 1957 when Bernice Wardens, the local hardware store owner, disappeared. Her store was found locked with blood stains on the floor. A receipt showed that Ed Gain had been her last customer that day. Police obtained a search warrant and went to Ed's farmhouse. What they found shocked even the most experienced officers. Inside the house were the remains of Bernice Wardens. Her body had been hung in a shed and gutted like a deer. As investigators searched further, they uncovered the horrific collection of human remains Ed had gathered over the years. Masks of human faces hung on the walls. Chairs were covered in human skin, and boxes contained organs. Some remains were traced back to missing women, though Ed admitted many came from graves he had robbed. The discoveries horrified the public. The idea that a quiet, seemingly harmless neighbor had been committing such grotesque acts shattered the sense of safety in small-town America. Newspapers across the country printed the details, and Ed Gain quickly became infamous. His crimes went beyond murder into a realm of depravity rarely seen. During interrogation, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Wardens and another local woman, tavern owner Mary Hogan, who had vanished in 1954. He also admitted to robbing graves, but claimed he had not killed most of the women whose remains were found in his house. His statements revealed a disturbed mind. He described entering trances when digging up bodies, and he explained how he crafted clothing and masks in an effort to transform himself into his mother. In 1958, Ed Gain was found mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric institution. For more than a decade, he remained there until doctors declared him fit for trial. In 1968, he was tried for the murder of Bernice Wardens. He was found guilty but insane, leading to his return to a mental hospital where he spent the remainder of his life. He died in 1984 at the age of 77. The case of Ed Gain left a lasting legacy not only in true crime history, but also in popular culture. His crimes inspired some of the most iconic horror characters in cinema, including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. His story raised questions about mental illness, isolation, and the dangers of unchecked obsession. For the people of Plainfield, the scars never fully healed. The town became associated with darkness it never asked for. Many locals avoided speaking about Ed Gain for decades, wishing to move past the horror. Yet the farmhouse where he committed his crimes became a site of morbid curiosity until it was eventually burned down. Ed Gain remains a figure of fascination because his crimes blurred the line between reality and nightmare. He was not the typical killer driven by greed or impulse. Instead, he was a man shaped by isolation, dominated by his mother, and consumed by fantasies that grew more grotesque after her death. His actions shock a nation because they revealed what can emerge from loneliness and obsession left unchecked. Even today, his story is studied in criminal psychology as an example of how trauma, control, and mental illness can twist a life into something almost unimaginable. Behind every horror film inspired by his deeds is the reminder that these terrors were once real in a small Wisconsin town where people thought they knew their neighbors.